Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Vladimir Putin proposes a high-tech duel between Russia and American missiles as he predicts dramatic changes in the war against Ukraine. Meanwhile, North Korea's Kim Jong-un is reportedly training and deploying fresh troops to support Russia on the battlefield. And Gisele Pelicot is jailed for 20 years for drugging and sexually assaulting his wife and inviting others to join in. Gisele Pelicot thanks supporters outside court as the historic mass rape trial comes to an end. To our top story, and Russia's President Vladimir Putin has proposed a high-tech duel with the US in Kyiv during his annual address in Moscow. Referencing the US missiles provided by the country, Putin predicted dramatic changes in the war. He also told the end-of-year conference that he's planning to talk with his former ally and ousted Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad, as well as US President-elect Donald Trump. Let's speak to our correspondent now in Moscow, Dasha Chernyshova. Thank you so much for joining us, Dasha. Dasha, Putin predicted dramatic changes in the war with Ukraine. What did he mean by this, and what changes could he actually be referencing to?
Well, indeed, the Russian president has been asked many questions on the ongoing special military operation in Ukraine, as Moscow insists we call it. And in those answers that he has been provided to the Russian public, as well as the journalists, he said Russia has had the upper hand in the area of this operation. He has said that Russian troops have been taking territory by square kilometers, not just by meters. And he insisted that the Russian military-industrial complex has been meeting the demands from the Russian military. Also, the Russian president has said that there are no preconditions for any talks when it comes to the negotiated settlement in Ukraine. However, he has stressed that the agreements that have been reached by Russia and the Ukrainian delegation in spring of 2022 in Istanbul should be taken as the basis for any negotiated settlement. He also has stressed that there are realities on the ground that are changing rapidly, with Russia again taking more control of more territories, and those realities will also have to be taken into account. So the Russian president has said that Moscow is ready to compromise, it is ready for talks. But again, he stressed that the Russian national interest, that the Russian concerns have to be addressed as well. So certainly the Russian president has once again reiterated the position we have heard repeatedly from Moscow. But obviously, with the flow of information and news lines coming about the possibility of ceasefire, those questions have persisted.
Putin says he plans to meet with Bashar al-Assad, a former ally turned refugee in his country. Could we see Putin potentially use Assad as a bargaining chip?
Well, it is very difficult to see how Moscow will be building its ties now with the former president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, after he has been granted asylum in Russia and had been flown to Moscow from the military base in Syria, mainly airfields that Russia has in that country. So we know from President Vladimir Putin that Moscow at the moment maintains dialogue and contacts with all of the forces that are in Syria. He has stressed that Moscow is willing to continue that dialogue. Moscow had offered to use its military bases in Syria for humanitarian purposes and the delivery of humanitarian aid as well. He has said, however, that Moscow will think about retaining those bases, saying that in this case, if those bases remain in Syria, there has to be the coincidence of the interests of Russia and the new Syrian authorities. All that is the subject of further negotiations. And speaking about Assad, Vladimir Putin had said that Russia had been fighting against terrorism in Syria. So it is just proving once again that what Moscow was willing to see is the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the Syrian Republic. Also, he has said that he had not met with Assad before, but he could be seen and sitting down with him in the Russian, on the Russian territory or somewhere else, because Moscow had not confirmed that Assad is actually in the Russian capital, although the letter that has been recently released by Assad was dated to be from Moscow.
We also heard him speak about talks with Donald Trump. Let's take a listen now.
What can I offer to the President-elect Trump when we meet? First of all, I don't know when we will meet because he doesn't say anything about it. I haven't spoken to him for more than 4 years, and I'm ready for it. Of course, at any time, and I will be ready for a meeting if he wants it. You and the people who pay your wages in the U.S. would be very much like Russia to be in a weakened position. I have a different point of view. I believe that Russia has become much stronger over the past 2 or 3 years. Why? Because we are becoming a truly sovereign country. We are no longer dependent on anyone.
So that was Putin there speaking about Trump. But let's just focus on President Biden. He's gone to great lengths to supply Ukraine with enough military aid until the end of his term in office. But what will be on the agenda when he speaks to Trump?
Well, we understand that for the Russian president, it is paramount to make sure that the sovereignty of Russia is ensured. And that has always been the position of the Russian officials. That's when the operation began, and even before the start of this operation, there have been concerns in Moscow about NATO encroachment, about the Ukrainian territory being turned into what Moscow has often referred to as anti-Russia. So in this possible meeting, it is very likely that the Russian president will be talking about those concerns and the need to alleviate those. And all that falls into the wider discussion about the architecture of security for Asia and Europe. So all those issues are paramount for Moscow and are likely to be raised in this possible discussion.
Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow, thank you so much for joining us. Now, South Korea believes its North leader Kim Jong-un is training new troops intended to fight for Russia. It comes after at least 100 North Koreans deployed to support Moscow's war efforts in Ukraine's Kursk region have been killed and thousands more injured. It's believed that Pyongyang has deployed more than 10,000 of their own troops to support Russia over the course of the war, as well as shipping containers of artillery rounds, rockets and rocket launchers. For more on this, I'm joined by the former British ambassador to North Korea, John Everard. John, thank you so much for joining us this evening. First of all, lawmakers in South Korea say the North soldiers have suffered heavy losses in Ukraine. What is your read on this?
In Russia rather than Ukraine, they're attacking the Ukrainian positions in Russia's Kursk region. It's very difficult to verify these figures, but on the other hand, there's no real reason to doubt them. We are looking at untrained and inexperienced soldiers in an unfamiliar environment. Great rumours circulating that they have particular difficulty confronting drones. They never really had to work with drones before. Also, rumours that the Russians use them effectively as cannon fodder. They make the North Koreans walk towards Ukrainian positions so that the Ukrainians are forced to open fire, thus revealing where they are, so that the Russians themselves can return fire. It's inevitable, if that is indeed what the Russians are doing, that casualties amongst the North Koreans are going to be extremely high. And if the initial figure of a deployment of 10,000 troops is correct, and the South Korean lawmakers are right, that around 1,000 have already been taken out of action with wounds of various kinds, 10% casualties over a couple of months is a very high rate.
Experts suggest North Korea's weapons are outdated. Troops, as you say, are inexperienced. Is Putin becoming desperate?
Well, yes. I think anybody who has to rely on North Korean munitions, which are of appallingly low quality, and on North Korean troops, which, as we were saying, are inexperienced and where there have been several instances of the North Koreans shooting Russian soldiers because they can't distinguish them from Ukrainians. That is an act of desperation. It also exposes great vulnerability, because if that supply of munitions and troops was ever cut off and North Korea isn't really very stable, then the Russian war effort in Ukraine would be very severely hampered.
And I just want to talk about Trump. He's entering the White House soon. He famously met Kim Jong-un. Is he the man to coordinate the end of this conflict, do you think?
We really don't know, do we? I mean, everybody remembers that not that long ago, Donald Trump was talking about ending the Ukraine war in a day. And people thought that he meant by that he simply forced President Zelensky to run up a white flag. But since then, we've had that extraordinary telephone conversation between President-elect Trump and President Putin just a few weeks ago, where, according to the Washington Post, Trump said, firstly, Putin was not to escalate. He seems to have issued almost an instruction to President Putin not to take the war to any kind of higher level. Also, he seems to have warned Putin that the United States maintains numerous troops in Europe, which was clearly a veiled threat. Now, the Kremlin was so upset by this conversation that it tried to pretend it never existed. This clearly wasn't what Vladimir Putin wanted to hear. But in the light of this conversation, I think we have to reassess what President Trump might do when in office. It's quite possible that he will lean quite heavily on President Putin, as well as urging President Zelensky, to reach some kind of agreement. Further point here, what's happened in Syria affects profoundly what happens in Ukraine for all kinds of reasons, but amongst others, that Russia looks weak, and President Trump famously despises losers. It's probable that President Putin's stock, in President Trump's estimation, has gone sharply down over the last fortnight.
John, North Korea and Russia signed a defence pact back in June, which includes a form of mutual defence. Does this mean NATO could be at war with North Korea also if an open conflict did break out between NATO and Russia?
It's a theoretical possibility. You would need to reach a situation which triggers the all for one and one for all clause in the NATO treaty, so that NATO as a bloc would be at war with Russia, and you would then have to have conflict with actual North Korean troops on the ground. So a few steps to go through before you got to that situation. But yes, it's not impossible.
John Everard, the former British ambassador to North Korea, thank you for your insights. Gisele Pelicot, the man responsible for drugging and sexually assaulting his wife and inviting others to rape her while she was unconscious, has been jailed for 20 years today, the maximum time available for aggravated rape in France. The 72-year-old had confessed to all the charges against Gisele Pelicot and was sentenced alongside 51 other men in Paris today. In total, the men responsible were jailed for more than 400 years. Outside court, Ms. Pelicot told reporters she was very emotional and thanked the people who had supported her through the trial.
The trial was a very difficult ordeal, and at this moment I'm thinking of all my 3 children, David, Caroline and Florian. I also think of my grandchildren because they are the future, and it is also for them that I fought this fight. My deepest gratitude is to all the people who supported me. I also think of all the other families that are touched by this tragedy. Finally, I'm thinking of the unrecognized victims whose stories often remain in the shadows. I want you to know that we are sharing the same fight.
We can now speak to our correspondent Ross Cullen in Paris, who's been covering this story for us. Ross, thank you for joining us. This has been one of the most shocking cases and has made headlines around the world, never mind in France. How did the judge's decision go down there today?
Well, hi, Leigh Ann. 3.5 months of harrowing evidence have now come to an end with the verdicts and the sentencing delivered by the judges in the southern city of Avignon on Thursday. And they did find all of the defendants guilty of rape. Now, Gisele Pelicot sentenced to 20 years found guilty of raping his wife, of drugging her, of having recruited men online to come to the family home and to attack Gisele Pelicot while she was unconscious in abuse that lasted 9 years. He was found guilty and sentenced to 20 years, of which he's likely to serve 2/3 of that sentence. And his lawyer says there is still the chance that they might appeal against that sentence. All of the other defendants were found guilty and given custodial terms ranging from 3 to 15 years. But there was outrage among some of the supporters outside a court when they learnt of the sentences, complaining that they were too short, they were too lenient, and Gisele Pelicot's children did say that they were disappointed by those sentences.
Gisele Pelicot spoke outside court today. She's showed huge strength throughout this whole trial. We did hear a short clip before. What else did she have to say, and what was her reaction to the overall sentencing?
Yeah, well, she was resolute, as she has been attending these hearings over the last 3.5 months, and she was there once again in court for the verdicts and the sentencing. After the court proceedings came to an end, she spoke at the courthouse, and she said that by opening the doors to this trial, I wished for society to join in the debates that were held. I never regretted this decision. Now, Leigh Ann, this is because she waived her anonymity. This trial could have been held behind closed doors, but Gisele Pelicot and her legal team took the decision to hold this in public to try to ensure that shame changes sides, is how Gisele Pelicot has put it. So the focus is not on her, not on the victim of the rape, but on those who have been committing the attacks.
This case has prompted calls from activists who believe consent should be included as a factor when it comes to accusations of rape, something we've heard a lot about during this trial. What more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's right. France's law at the moment, in terms of the legal definition of rape, focuses on a coercion, threat, violence or surprise. Consent is not included in it at the moment, and there have been calls for consent to be incorporated into a new legal definition of rape. In fact, some of the defence that was put forward during the trial of those defendants who were then convicted on Thursday was that they didn't believe it was rape because they either thought Gisele Pelicot was pretending to sleep, or that they believed the consent and approval given by her then husband was sufficient enough for the assaults they were committing on Gisele Pelicot not to be classed as such.
Ross Cullen in Paris, thank you so much for joining us. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making headlines today. Israel says its fighter jets have carried out a series of strikes against military targets in Yemen belonging to Iran-backed Houthis. An Israeli spokesman said the targets included Red Sea ports and energy infrastructure in the capital city. Reports from a Houthi-run TV station say 9 people were killed in the Hudaydah province. This comes hours after a missile fired from Yemen was intercepted over central Israel. French President Emmanuel Macron has arrived in Mayotte as the island continues to reel from the devastation caused by Cyclone Chido. Macron landed in the French Indian Ocean territory this morning and said he brought 4 tons of food and health cargo with him. French officials say at least 31 people have died while thousands are still missing after Saturday's deadly storm. The US Supreme Court has agreed to hear last-ditch legal arguments from TikTok as to why it should not be banned or sold in America. The government is taking action against the social media app because of what it says are its links to the Chinese state, which both TikTok and its parent company ByteDance deny. Earlier this month, the Federal Appeals Court rejected an attempt to overturn the legislation. At least 13 people have died and 2 more are missing after an Indian Navy speedboat ploughed into the side of a passenger ferry off the coast of Mumbai following an engine malfunction. According to officials, 3 Navy personnel are among the dead, while more than 100 people have been rescued. Footage posted online showed the speedboat circling before colliding with the ferry, which later capsized. And the Japanese city Fukushima is going to start naming and shaming people who break the rules around household rubbish. Starting in March, officials will go through bags of trash that don't meet regulations, such as those which have not been sorted correctly or which exceed size limits, and in some cases publicly identify their owners. The new regulations are part of Japan's long push to enhance its waste management system. Countries around the world are preparing for the uncertainty of a second Donald Trump presidency, with many central banks adding a note of caution to their 2025 outlook. The incoming US president has promised a range of tariffs and threatened to deport millions of illegal immigrants, which is likely to affect the global economy. Nick Harper has this report from Washington.
It was all smiles at the New York Stock Exchange on Wednesday at the closing bell, but the Dow Jones's 1,100-point drop told a different story. US markets have fallen for the last 10 days, wiping billions off share prices and worrying investors about what comes next. One bit of certainty is a second Donald Trump presidency, but what that looks like is in itself creating uncertainty. He's warned he'll impose tariffs on Canada, Mexico and China, for starters, and his mass deportation plan could see 11 million migrants forced out of the US. That would drastically reduce the workforce, causing GDP, by some estimates, to shrink by more than $1 trillion. For the US Federal Reserve, that's creating a wait-and-see situation.
We just don't know really very much at all about the actual policies, so it's very premature to try to make any kind of conclusion. We don't know what will be tariffed from what countries, for how long, in what size. We don't know whether there'll be retaliatory tariffs. We don't know what the transmission of any of that will be into consumer prices.
On Wednesday, the US Central Bank cut interest rates, but forecast fewer rate reductions next year, pointing to the uncertainty factor of Trump's possible policies. It was a similar message from the Bank of England and the Bank of Japan. Both on Thursday kept interest rates unchanged.
Uncertainty remains in the US and overseas economic outlook. There's also significant uncertainty in the incoming US administration's economic policies.
Norway, Sweden, Canada, Europe, all of their central banks are signalling uncertainty and weakening outlooks for 2025.
I think you're going to start to see more and more folks there that say, you know what, we're in an environment, we need to sit tight, let this play out, and try not to be involved too much in the market.
The economic impacts of Trump's return remain unclear, even as many countries are still struggling with stubborn post-pandemic inflation. It's still another month before Donald Trump returns to the White House, but he's already rattled central bankers, who for now are waiting on policies that could create global turmoil. Nick Harper, Al Arabiya News, Washington.
Let's take a look at the top business news. The Belfast shipyard, Harland & Wolff, responsible for building the Titanic, has been saved from administration by Spanish state-owned shipbuilder Navantia. Around 1,000 jobs will be kept as part of the deal, which also includes Harland & Wolff's other facilities in Scotland and England. Navantia currently employs more than 4,000 people and has an annual turnover of around 1.3 billion euros. El Salvador has agreed a $1.4 billion loan deal with the International Monetary Fund in order to scale back on its Bitcoin policies. The South American country was the first in the world to make Bitcoin legal tender in 2021. The IMF said risks related to the world's largest cryptocurrency, which hit a record high this week, have now eased. Turning to sports now, and Texan-based Friedkin Group, who also own Italian Syria club Roma, has completed the takeover of Everton today. It's thought the deal is worth around £400 million, making the Merseyside club the 10th team to be under majority American ownership in the Premier League. CEO Dan Friedkin has said he is honoured to become a custodian of the great institution and has been proposed as chairman of Everton's board. And New Zealand's Liam Lawson will race for Red Bull in 2025 as he's promoted to the F1 front line, joining world champion Max Verstappen. It comes as the team parts way with Mexican driver Sergio Perez. Red Bull boss Christian Horner said Lawson is capable of delivering strong results and will come out on top. Christmas markets have long been popular in continental Europe, attracting visitors from far and wide to sample local food and offering a chance to buy some last-minute presents. But in recent years, these festive events have exploded in popularity in the UK. The number of established markets has more than tripled, and sizable annual Christmas markets can be found in most towns and also cities. John Beaver went to one of the biggest in the UK to find out what's behind the rise.
In the middle of this World Heritage Site in southwest England, Bath Christmas Market is now an established part of the city's calendar. Hundreds of vendors are visited by hundreds of thousands of customers.
For us it's vital, really. I would say probably we really couldn't survive really without the market. It's very important for us, definitely.
This tea company enjoyed record sales on the opening weekend. Its owner believes the market is offering something different to consumers.
I think with the rise of big supermarket chains and big brands, people are starting to feel that they want something a little bit more special, a little bit more handmade, from local businesses and locally sourced, so they can actually get something that you can't get anywhere else.
Once a staple of Germany and continental Europe, recent research has found that larger Christmas markets have now become tourist destinations in their own right.
Christmas markets are now big business in the UK, and they've become increasingly popular in recent years. From around 30 in 2007, there are now more than 100, and they can be found in every corner of the country.
The market is organised and run by the local council. They're quick to point out the importance of the events on the wider economy.
When we get it right, the impact's massive, and I think last year we brought in about 47 million into the local economy, and we welcomed about 450,000 people over the course of the sort of nearly 3 weeks that it was running. But it's massive for our local restaurants, pubs, bars, for the local tourism sector, where people stay in the city and spend more time. So everyone in that sector is really benefiting.
Markets are sometimes criticised for being too expensive and taking business away from some traditional shops. But their popularity is still growing, becoming an established part of the festive calendar. John Beaver, Al Arabiya News, Bath.
Oh, I do love a Christmas market, but let's get you a reminder of those top stories. Vladimir Putin proposes a high-tech duel between Russian and American missiles as he predicts dramatic changes in the war against Ukraine. Meanwhile, North Korea's Kim Jong-un is reportedly training and deploying fresh troops to support Russia on the battlefield. And Dominique Pellico is jailed for 20 years for drugging and sexually assaulting his wife and inviting others to join in. Gisele Pelicot thanks supporters outside court as the historic mass rape trial comes to an end. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you for joining us. Special interviews with boxing legends Eddie Hearn and Tyson Fury are coming up next. And don't miss Tom Burges Watson with GNT. Good night.
Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Al Arabiya News. I'm your host, Michal Prendergast. I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Eddie Hearn, the chairman of Matchroom Sports, to discuss Fury versus Usyk, which is taking place in Riyadh on Saturday. Eddie, thank you so much for your time. So, Fury has said he's going to annihilate Usyk. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, Fury's a great talker, you know, and listen, a lot of the time he's delivered throughout his career. I think he's going to have to do something extraordinary to win this fight, but he's capable of doing extraordinary things. You know, we've seen it in the past, and I think high-level sport and boxing is no different. All comes down to performance on the night. You know, you can say anything you want, but you know that Alexander Usyk is going to be special on Saturday night. He always is. He's the pound-for-pound #1 fighter in the world, in my opinion. But Tyson Fury, you know, let's not forget, the last fight was very close. But he's got a lot of work to do on Saturday. I think Usyk has to be the favourite, but Fury can do it. But he's going to be the underdog in my eyes.
And I suppose even with Fury and the fact that in his last camp, he had that really bad eye injury. He couldn't spar, I believe, for 8 weeks. How much of a factor is that going to play?
Yeah, I mean, I think last time, I don't think his preparation would have been perfect. You know, like you said, he had the cut. He had a short time in training camp. This time he would have been able to spar, you know, well. Don't forget, he suffered his first defeat of his career against Alexander Usyk. And, you know, that's difficult to take and difficult to accept. And people bounce back in different ways. You know, you'd expect him to bounce back with vengeance. But he's like I said, he's got a tough task ahead of him. But I don't think there'll be any excuses from training camp or whatever. I think you'll get the best Tyson Fury that there can be on Saturday.
And obviously His Excellency Turki Al-Sheikh has said, obviously in the video, he said to Tyson Fury, I want you to do the job. I want you to set up the trilogy. Is this something that you're looking forward to?
Yeah, I mean, obviously from our side, you know, we've got Anthony Joshua and an Anthony Joshua-Tyson Fury fight would be a huge global event as well. So I think everything will be decided on Saturday. If it's another amazing fight, which it could well be, and Fury wins, could set up a trilogy fight between the two of them. But we're just very lucky that obviously through Riyadh season, we're getting to see these incredible nights, and Saturday could be the biggest yet.
As you just mentioned, Eddie, in terms of the box office, the fight the world is waiting to see is AJ versus Fury. In terms of the biggest box office ever, do you think it could break records?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for years, and still to this day, I keep getting asked, when's it going to happen? When's it going to happen? Obviously, if Fury wins the fight on Saturday, that sets up a massive fight with AJ. If he loses the fight, it's still a huge fight with AJ. You know, we've got the potential of a Daniel Dubois rematch as well. So I think AJ's next fight will be Fury or Dubois. I don't see many other big fights out there for him. He just wants the biggest fights available to him. So the result of Saturday will be very important for Anthony Joshua as well.
Absolutely. And in terms of sporting events in the world, obviously Saudi has just been awarded the FIFA World Cup in 2034. You yourself have taken part in some of the biggest events in Saudi. How excited are you to witnessing the World Cup in the Kingdom?
You know what? I think until you've been to the Kingdom and witnessed what's happening here, it's very difficult to understand. You know, I've been coming here since 2019 when Anthony Joshua boxed Andy Ruiz. The change is quite incredible. You know, it is genuinely one of my favourite places in the world to come. The weather, the hotels, the hospitality, but also the energy and the vibrancy of the youth in this country. You know, there's an incredible amount of change happening. And people are very excited and embracing the incredible schedule of sporting and entertainment events that are landing in the kingdom. And, you know, people talk about the reasons behind it. The reasons behind it is because the country is changing. And, you know, if it changes through sport, even better for me, because I think sport is not just the greatest educator in the world, but in terms of entertainment, it can't be beaten. And obviously it's our business as well. So this week we've got the snooker happening as well here. Ronnie O'Sullivan and all the best snooker players in the world. You've got Fury Usyk. You know, it's absolutely non-stop. And really, to bring the World Cup here is just another level. And what I can tell you is every event that I've ever done in Saudi has been delivered to the highest possible standards. So you know that the World Cup, you know, every stop is going to be pulled out to make this one of the greatest World Cups ever. And you know the kingdom will deliver. Like, there is absolutely no doubt. So what a moment for the country. And, you know, the work will continue, I guess, for Saudi Arabia and the government until then to get everything perfectly right. And in the meantime, so many sporting events in particularly Riyadh season schedule. It's just incredible.
Yes, I completely agree. And to go back to the snooker, obviously there's been a lot of reporting on the $1 million prize to score a maximum in snooker at the moment. Obviously, we all remember the days in snooker in the UK when obviously you had the prize of £147,000 for hitting a maxi. But the prize money has dwindled over the years. How excited are you again to see these sorts of prize money for maximum breaks in snooker? Is it good for the sport?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you know, we even added a Riyadh season golden ball to the table, which actually is worth 20 points, which gives you a 167, right? And that was an idea from His Excellency, Turki Al-Sheikh, because he just wants to innovate and he wants to, you know, interact and attract the viewers. Snooker has huge global audience, but it is a sport that is, you know, has got an aging audience in that respect because it's a traditional broadcast event, normally on linear TV. You know yourself, like it's an institutionalized event on the BBC. You know, it's huge in China. And what he's done is just to try and create more interest. Obviously, last year it was $500,000 for the 167. Now it's $1 million, and every player is aggressively trying to make that break, and it just makes the game more exciting. So snooker's been a great addition to the kingdom amongst a plethora of sports and events, and it's underway here again in the kingdom this week.
I agree. I'm actually a huge fan of snooker as well. So in terms of other sporting opportunities, a man who is obviously similar to yourself in terms of promotion is Dana White. He himself has said he would like to set up a boxing promotion. Would you ever see yourself working with him closely on that in the future?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a great relationship with Dana. I think if he was to come into boxing, it would be great for boxing and the profile of the sport. I don't know if it's going to be something that he's going to want to do because it's a very frustrating business. And, you know, he has such a great model with the UFC where he kind of has ownership and central contracts to just tell fighters, you're fighting him, you're fighting him. Where in boxing, it's kind of like a negotiation process to go through so many different layers of trainers and advisors and managers and lawyers. And that might frustrate him, but it would be great for boxing. And of course, we'd welcome him with open arms. And, you know, they've got a great business at UFC and TKO, do a lot of business here in Riyadh and the Middle East as well. So, yeah, it would be great for the sport.
And just lastly, obviously, I'm an Irishman. It would be a sin if I didn't ask you about Katy Taylor. Obviously, I believe there's a deadline in January where it will have to be announced her next fight. The whole country of Ireland is hoping it will be held in Croke Park. Could you tell us any more details on that?
Yeah, I mean, we've got mandatory in Chantel Cameron, but also, of course, you know, off the back of those huge viewing figures, there is potential to do Taylor against Serrano 3. The last fight was incredible. The first fight was incredible. And, you know, Katy is coming to the end of her career. There's no doubt about it. The dream has always been Croke Park. Now she's probably bigger than ever off the back of that Netflix event. And I think we could do it. And, you know, if we can make the numbers work, and we could speak to our friends at MVP and Jake Paul and those guys, why not? It would be historic. You know, 2025 could be Katy's last year in the sport. She's coming off two of her greatest victories in Chantel Cameron and Amanda Serrano. If we could set up that dream for her of Croke Park, it would be an incredible experience.
Eddie Hearn, the chairman of Matchroom Sports, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation. Hello and welcome, I'm Riz Khan. Saudi Arabia is in the sporting spotlight for the second time in a week as boxing joins football in global coverage of the kingdom. First, FIFA confirmed that Saudi Arabia will be hosting the 2034 World Cup. Then two faces familiar to the residents of Riyadh step back into the ring for a rematch for the ages. Alexander Usyk versus Tyson Fury. Well, I had a chance to sit down with Tyson Fury for a rematch of our own first interview. Tyson, nice to get round two with you a few months on. Looking back on the fight from last time, did you underestimate Alexander Usyk, do you think?
No, I didn't. No, he got a decision over me. He won by 1 point. Very close fight. Good luck to the guy. We're going to run it back on Saturday, and it's going to be victory for me.
Fingers crossed. But the thing is, you now know each other's tactics pretty well.
Yeah.
Is there any chance that perhaps the fight will go in a similar way, similar style?
It might do, yeah. Well, it'll all play out on Saturday night how it plays out, really.
Now, I know both you and Alexander Usyk are Manchester United fans.
Are we?
So you might, well, apparently, yeah. So
I didn't know he was.
You must be both happy about the victory against the arch rivals Man City.
Yes, good little victory. Yeah. City are on a big losing streak at the moment.
But it also came at a time when Saudi got announced with the FIFA 2034 Cup.
Yes.
Now, knowing the country as you do, with the sports here, what do you expect from a Saudi World Cup?
I think it's going to be a fantastic World Cup. First of all, congratulations to Saudi on getting the FIFA World Cup 32. I think it'll be a fantastic event. Any sporting event that's held in Saudi is usually a marvellous event. So I'm sure the biggest sporting event on earth, the FIFA World Cup, will be even bigger.
Now, it's true because when you look at boxing along with football, UFC, tennis, Formula One, and live golf, for example, it's transforming the Saudi scene. And what's it like for you to have played quite a major role in that kind of transformation?
It's been fantastic. It's been a fantastic opportunity for me to come here and showcase over in Saudi Arabia and also get the biggest fights that's possible on earth.
Well, so many of the great popular dramas of our time, from The Godfather to The Matrix and Lord of the Rings, have been trilogies. Even your own famous trilogy versus Daytona Wilder. Now, His Excellency Turki al-Sheikh recently said he wants you to do the job in the rematch to pave the way for the Fury Usyk trilogy next year. What do you think? Will that trilogy happen?
I think it's going to happen, yes. I think it'll happen. When I win on Saturday night, I think there's got to be a trilogy next year for sure.
Now, there are fans, millions of fans who'd love to see you, still eager to see you fight Anthony Joshua. You famously said Joshua was losing to Dubois, cost you £150 million in lost revenue for your super fight against him. What would the trilogy take precedence over a Fury versus Joshua?
For sure. Fight? Joshua's in tatters at the moment. He's got to pick up the pieces from his last fight. But the fight with Usyk, again, the one on Saturday and then one afterwards will be fantastic for me.
Now, Mike Tyson has thrown his support behind you in your fight with Usyk. And we just saw him step into the ring and lose to the YouTube megastar Jake Paul last month. What did you make of that bout? And just out of curiosity, would we ever expect to see you fight Jake Paul when you're 58 maybe?
No, definitely not. Not for me at 58. Mike's an awesome guy, and to get back in the ring at 58 takes a lot of guts. And, you know, he needs to be respected for that. And, you know, it was big for boxing, one of the biggest fights that boxing's ever seen with Jake and Mike. And I thought it was fantastic. You know, obviously Mike didn't get the result, but it was good for Mike, good for Mike's pocket, and good for Jake's pocket too. So fantastic for boxing.
When I asked you last time, though, would you step into the ring at around 60? You said, if the price is right.
Always. I'm a prize fighter.
Okay. Now, it's coming. This bout's coming around near the Christmas time, the Christmas season for a lot of people in the Western world, especially. And I wonder what the Fury household is like around this time of the year.
Mayhem. There's a lot of sweets and chocolates and cooking going on. A lot of action.
You know, last time we spoke, we had the chance to do this 12 quick fire questions, where I asked you about competitions, who would win against who. This time, let's do an interesting one if we can. Okay. We do like 10 rounds of names, which, when I say the name, if you can, give me a one-word description for that name.
Yep.
You want to try that? So, Alexander Usyk.
The cat.
Okay.
Rabbit.
3 words.
Just one then, rabbit.
Anthony Joshua.
Sausage.
All right. Eddie Hearn.
Fast.
Okay. I won't ask you to explain these just yet, but anyway, Turkey El Sheikh.
Excellent.
Okay. Donald Trump.
President.
Elon Musk.
Genius.
Muhammad Ali.
The greatest. Well, that's 2.
Mike Tyson.
Legend.
Okay, and then your dad, John Fury.
Papa.
Be careful with this last one. Your wife, Paris.
A witch.
We'll have to cut that one, I think.
That'd be all right.
Tyson Fury, thank you so much. Really, what a pleasure.
All the best. Thanks
Always.
again.
Thank you, sir.
All the best.
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Just days after America's chaotic and deadly withdrawal from Afghanistan, a daring film crew embedded themselves with the Taliban, capturing a story the world has never seen before. Over the course of the year, they documented the shocking realities of a group totally unprepared for power, but wielding billions of dollars in abandoned U.S. military hardware.
Desiree, thank you so much for joining Al Arabiya. I want to kick off by asking you what brought you to this project.
In those first days after the U.S. pullout, they were quite euphoric and sort of willing to give access, willing to give interviews. They sort of were presenting themselves as this Taliban 2.0, you know, different from the previous Taliban, and within that package, willing to sort of do interviews. And that was the window that Ibrahim went in with. And keeping that access over 1 year was much harder than actually getting it in the first place. And even though getting it, we got it with the lower level Mukhtar, the second character, and sort of worked his way up to the big boss.
I noticed this sort of tendency throughout the film for these guys constantly to be looking over their shoulder, in the sense they were always fearful of being infiltrated. And no doubt this was something that they feared as well.
For sure. Yeah. For sure. Especially, I think, the longer he stayed, because they just, you know, it's like they even explain in the film, they're like, well, what's he doing? He's making a documentary. It's like a movie, but with real people, you know? And I think that but what's interesting about that is he had one person with him, his translator, Adele, who was really trusted, and he was like the only person that was with Ibrahim really this whole time.
Mm-hmm.
And the first time that there was this kind of threat voiced towards Ibrahim while he was filming, Adele translated it, and he said to Adele, "Don't ever translate that stuff to me again." And he didn't. He really listened to that. And when we got into the edit and we started translating all the material, Ibrahim himself was surprised in these moments. Like, he'd send me screenshots from the translation team, just like, "Oh my God, look at this."
Yeah.
You know, and that was sort of when that whole side of it started to become more apparent.
And more real to him, no doubt.
Yeah.
By keeping it for later,
yeah,
he was probably able to focus more.
Yeah. And keep going back, because he took breaks. He would go for like a certain period, 6 to 8 weeks or something, until he could feel like they were just tired of him, you know?
Yeah.
And then he would leave, and he would sort of wait until, you know, give them a moment, and then start approach again, like, can I come back? I really need to film this, da, da, da. And he would go back again. And each time going back, I think he was just quite nervous about everything.
Taking a bigger risk.
Taking a bigger risk, yeah.
So to do what's been done in Hollywoodgate, to take those risks as a filmmaker, that's something that is difficult for other people to get their head around. Why in the world would you risk your life to go be with people that, as you say, the world has a very, very negative perception of? Why was this important? And frankly, does he fear for his life?
Well, I think Ibrahim, deep down inside, does have some kind of fear for the risk that he's taken and the position that it puts him in now, also being a spokesperson for this film.
Yeah.
But he would never admit it, because he felt and feels so deeply for the pain that the Afghan people are going through.
Yeah. And you see multiple times in the film where they're questioning why he's there. You know, there's one statement about if he doesn't do what he says he's going to do and keep his word in terms of representing us, we'll kill him.
Yeah. Which actually he didn't know fully, because he told his translator, who was with him the whole time, after the first threat came through, he was like, "Don't translate that stuff for me." And Adele actually listened, and so those things were discovered in the edit later, and he'd be sending me screenshots saying, "Oh my God, look what they're saying," you know? So he wasn't fully aware, but he definitely felt it. He wasn't ignorant to it.
Yeah.
And the last day, the parade that we shot, that was the last thing we shot, because it was very clear to him that that was dangerous. Yes, exactly. Because we had sort of been filming within one section of the leadership, but on that day, all the leadership was there. And Ibrahim was the only person on that stage with a camera.
Yeah.
And so other parts of the leadership, I think the head of security, et cetera, they noticed him, and they were like, "Wait, who are you and what are you doing here?
Yes.
And you're coming with us." And he actually ran away from that after the parade, went straight to Kabul airport and caught the first plane out, and that was the last time that he was there.
Yeah.
And the burner phones that we had with the subjects, he deleted them and, you know, stopped those accounts after a few weeks of leaving.
The very idea of going in to a place like Afghanistan, where the U.S. has just, you know, made this disastrous withdrawal, putting your feet on the ground when you know that your life will be at risk in every moment. Most people would say, he must be crazy.
I know.
Is Ibrahim crazy?
No, he's just a deeply empathetic person. He grew up in Egypt.
Yeah.
He grew up, you know, also observing. He also was a journalist before at Al Jazeera.
Yes.
And when he was a journalist, he worked in a TV show where they interviewed prominent leaders in the Middle East, etc. And he observed, you know, groups like the Taliban throughout his years growing up in journalism, and how people sort of revered them. And he always questioned this sort of praise of these kind of groups. And he knew that when they were coming back into power, that it meant devastation for the Afghan people. And I think he just felt deeply compelled to not allow that to be forgotten. And
to tell that story.
Yes, exactly, and tell that story. And he, honestly, he just, he really didn't think of the
danger.
The danger, and also the psychological toll that it takes on you, because we had to get him therapy, like in between.
Yes.
And this was really helpful because it's very difficult to sort of be within an ideology all day long that you don't agree with and not be able to say anything.
To lose your voice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he, early on, there's one story that he told recently that I only heard recently from him, that in the early days, there was one younger Talib who seemed really intelligent, you know, and he sort of had a dialogue with him, and he was like, you seem so intelligent, like, why are you in this? Why are you doing, like, you could get a degree, you could be an engineer, you could go and, like, do something with your life. And that young Talib went to his commander and was like, you know what, I don't want to do this. I want to go and be an engineer, and I have other dreams maybe for myself. And the commander was like, where did you get these ideas?
Wow.
And he said, well, that cameraman. And he was called here, and you ever say something like that again, like, you're dead, you know?
Wow.
And so that he then kept his mouth shut. He understood that saying anything to anyone was going to endanger him.
Yeah.
And he kept his mouth shut, and he kept his camera rolling. And he kept his camera rolling, you know, there's so much that we had to shoot to sort of just appease them.
No doubt.
You know? Like all their propaganda ideas, right? Because this film's very much about how they think they're going to use,
how they
learn
perceived.
from Hollywood, which is part of the title, even though it's on the gate, about propaganda. Oh, okay, now maybe we should start to create propaganda.
Yes.
And they're even learning that to use on their own people now, right? This narrative of, oh, the West is this, the infidels, the whatever, right? Propaganda is such a powerful tool in the mechanisms of creating war and control, right?
Yes.
Controlling society. And we had to shoot, so he was always watched and controlled what he would shoot, right? And the bits that we made the film with were like the bits in between when they forgot, because he spent so many hours there. And he would sit in rooms just holding the camera on them so they'd forget about the camera.
Yes.
And it wouldn't even be on because he knew he was shooting stuff that he's not going to use for hours and hours. And forget about the camera, they forget they're mic'd up, and then click, you know, start rolling.
That's the moment.
And and the film was built through those in-between moments.
Yeah, it's fascinating the idea of that bird's eye view in those very first days, because it was very clear that they, as the Taliban, you know, had stumbled into a victory that they never anticipated.
Yeah.
And you really see, I mean, as someone who covered the departure from Afghanistan, at least from a journalist's perspective, what it must have been really like for them walking into those buildings and seeing the mess that the coalition forces had left behind. And even they were surprised. How could they have left all of this here?
Yeah, right?
Like total surprise.
No, and even a friend of mine who's incredibly intelligent, when she watched the film, she was like, honestly, I don't even look at it as like the Taliban and this and that. It's like one sort of foreign group, almost anthropological study of like what happens to a certain culture when they come in contact with another culture, right? Because they start to pick up these things and these objects, and they see all these objects, and you can see when they are walking out of the caves, they say, well, if we had all this stuff, we would rule the world, right? So it's how these things start to infuse them also with ideas and change the way they think even, right?
Yeah.
And then they fix the weapons and what they, you know, how they end up with like calling the Tajikistan and threatening them.
I found it very interesting as well. I mean, walking into that hangar, the shots of the planes.
Right.
For me, this just sort of in every way symbolized, frankly, what America, sadly, has become in that part of the world.
Yeah.
And it was hearkening back to the days of Vietnam and the fall of Saigon. And we heard that analogy made time and time again. In your mind, what does this film mean in terms of a broader representation of what's happened over the last several years? Because if you look at the fall of Afghanistan, this disastrous departure, And then 4 years on, we have multiple wars, a deeply destabilized Middle East, even right now what's happening in Syria. And many would say that this is a direct result of the U.S. leaving Afghanistan, that this started a chain reaction. Putin would not have invaded Ukraine. Israel would not be doing what it's doing in Gaza, et cetera. And that may be a false assertion, but certainly to those who've watched the region as I have, and you have for decades, it feels as if that was the beginning.
Yeah. War begets war begets war.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Is it ever the solution? I mean, obviously we look at that and we question this war machine, right? You have to question, is that the way to do it? Because no, we set these weird, unreachable goals, right? It started in Afghanistan as we're going after bin Laden, and then it became
nation building,
freedom, democracy. Look at Iraq. It's not working.
Yeah.
We have to obviously come up with a different way forward.
Yeah. When you think about sort of, you picked Hollywoodgate, you also obviously did Navalny. What do these types of films mean to you?
The truth, you know? I think it's really important in film. What can you see through a film? 90 minutes with Alexei Navalny, I feel like, will give you so much more understanding of him as a human being than whatever you read in the news, you know, 2 minutes here, 2 minutes there. It's like you lived with him. You felt his sincerity, right?
Yes.
Watching what we left behind, Afghanistan now, just the destruction and the people that are suffering there. You know,
it's incredible.
It's like the Western media would love us to just forget and they don't focus on it anymore.
Exactly.
And that's what hopefully this film will get people to do, is just look at it. We don't just move on from Iraq. We don't just move on from Afghanistan. Afghanistan's still there. Iraq is still there. It has Syria.
Yeah.
You know?
These are the messes we've left behind.
Exactly.
I've challenged several world leaders, most recently the First Lady of Pakistan, about Afghans women and the situation in which they find themselves, consistently rolling back every freedom. And the narrative that we see is that we gave them great promise for 20 years and then we utterly abandoned them.
I mean, it's horrific. Women right now, like, you know, the laws that were passed recently, they cannot speak outside of their own home. They can't go to a park with their child.
Yeah.
They can't go grocery shop. Like, they have to be, you know, supervised by a man. And still at the grocery store, I was speaking to an Afghan refugee recently whose wife is still in Kabul. I was like, so if she needs to go to the grocery store, how does that work? You know, he says, my brother or my uncle or someone comes over and takes her to the store. But still, even at the store, she can't speak. So she wants tomatoes. It's like, like trying to gesture. Can you imagine a woman, like even in a grocery store, which is, I mean.
They're erasing women.
It's completely, you can't sit like on the outside of your house and face the sun, right? You can't sing even inside your own house because your voice might carry. You can't read aloud inside your own house certain things. You can't have conversations with other women about certain topics. Like, those women are in prison.
One of the characters in the film, one of the people in the film, has basically said to his wife, you can't be a doctor anymore. You have to stay home. You have to follow Sharia. And this caused quite a bit of a conversation because the implementation of Taliban 2.0 was still in those early days up for debate.
Right. And can you imagine, had he let his wife be a doctor and maybe come to that base with him when they discover all those medicines that are left behind by our army, right? And what she would have maybe seen in those medicines and been able to implement it and at least get it into society before they all expired for the general population. Obviously, they don't care about the general population because those sat there expiring and his wife sat at home cooking.
When you think about your subjects, the way you choose to get involved in films, what is the one sort of similarity that they all have?
Fighting for the truth to be seen.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
It's something that just drives me. You know, it's like you're dealing with situations that are so sensitive, people that are holding a lot, politically sensitive, emotionally, you know. And when you are a documentarian, you have to sort of embed in those situations. You become very close to the subjects, right? I lived in the Black Forest with Alexei Navalny, and Yulia, etc., for months, and was there the last day that we put him on the plane back to Russia, you know, and carrying Ibrahim through Hollywoodgate. It's you become very close, right? And yet you have to sort of make sure that you still keep a distance enough to make an objective film.
Yeah.
Which is challenging.
No doubt. I mean, you go into these situations perhaps with the preconceived notion of what it is you want to do or what you expect to see, and that, I assume, gets blown up pretty quickly.
I go into situations where we don't have an idea, and those are the situations that excite me.
Yeah.
That just like, let's follow it. Mm-hmm. You know, like when we went in to meet Alexei Navalny, we didn't know they were going to make this phone call to Kudratsev. We didn't know he was going to go back. We just knew he'd been poisoned, and he was sitting, and he had just come out of a coma, and what was happening to this interesting figure, you know? So I feel like I'm sort of drawn to the person, because I know the person is going to walk an interesting path.
Yes.
And let's see where that path goes. So even the film I shot in Ukraine during the war, I was covering negotiations between Russia, Ukraine at first, but then those fell apart very quickly, and it became negotiations for weapons, negotiations with foreign nations, diplomacy. So I was very close to Kuleba while he was foreign minister. Rustem Umerov, who became the Minister of Defense. And I had no idea every day sort of where that story would go, you know?
Yeah. When you were shooting with Alexei Navalny, did you have a sense then that he was getting on a plane to his death?
No, absolutely not. And I don't know. He's such an optimistic person that he knew he was heading into potentially a grave challenge. But at the same time, I think 50% of him hoped that everything would be fine, you know? I think that he even hoped that upon immediate return, he would potentially not even go to prison, you know, because truth was on his side. And Navalny was someone that believed in the truth. Yeah. And the trials that he was facing at that time were these sham trials. And then they sort of put him in prison for a small period of time. And then they started implementing all these new laws around extremism, around terrorism, right? They retroactively labeled his organization a terrorist organization and then tried him for that. That wasn't even existing when he was leaving. And the war hadn't started yet. So he sort of we didn't really fully know how far Putin was willing to go.
In hindsight, it's easier to say, oh, he was naive.
Right.
But you don't see it that way.
No, I think that when you are someone like Navalny who, you know, commits to fighting for that kind of path, for the future of the country the dream that you hold for that country, you have to be an optimistic person. Yeah. You know?
Obviously, in Hollywoodgate, there were opportunities to frankly break news, as we would say. And I'm talking about, you know, the Russians and what they were attempting to do in Afghanistan, fighting a covert war, essentially.
Well, you know, Christo Grozev, who I worked with so closely on Navalny, he is just the most genius investigator. And for the last 4 years, he's been on and off working on an investigation about Russia's involvement with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Yeah. And then he saw I sent him early footage when I started working on it, because I was like, look, this is really interesting. But at that point, we hadn't shot these shots at the end with Arkhipov and the Russians, Iranians, etc., that you see on the stage at the end of the film. And when he saw the full film, I think it was in June here in London, he immediately, in his sort of Christo style, did like the reverse face search and started figuring out who's this Russian guy on the stage. And it was the missing link to this huge investigation around a Russian bounty program where they were basically paying the Taliban per head of U.S. soldier that they were able to kill, which led to many suicide bombings and
some of the biggest attacks.
Right, attacks on U.S. convoys, U.S. bases. And this was at the time covered up because the negotiations with the White House, with the Taliban were going on. And then even when Biden came to power, it was continued. They continued to sort of not look at that situation, and so
as if not to muddy the waters.
Right, and this whole investigation is now out, as you see in
the New York Times. Yeah, it's to a journalist, it looks as if just the great game is alive and well when you're talking about so many different powers. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, when you see reports of Russian interference, whether it be in Afghanistan or elsewhere, elections, for example, in the United States, you don't find any of this surprising.
No, and I think that is the genius of this kind of filmmaking and documentary filmmaking, where you just capture and you're there and you capture. Like at the time, we didn't know that we were capturing these individuals, right?
Yeah.
And you just make the film, and these kind of films are so hard to make and so hard to distribute these days. Mm-hmm. And I hope that this huge investigation shows the value of this kind of filmmaking, that it helps us sort of. It's a deeper look and a deeper investigation, and helps us to understand the world we're living in better.
I imagine that sort of ability to spend the time, to engage with the people at this kind of level, over days, over months, over years. Mm-hmm. Very different from what the mainstream media is able to accomplish simply because of budget. What is the toughest thing in that sense for documentary filmmakers? Is it the budgeting? Is it the time constraints? I mean, where's the sort of challenge there?
It's the life
because you are giving up your
limitation,
life.
Right?
Yeah.
Like in Ukraine, I think I'd lived there for 6, 7, 8 months, sort of back and forth on those overnight trains. Living
it's
out
literal
of
immersion.
Suitcase. It really is, and you just like, as far as another life, like I don't have a family, I don't have kids. It is. It takes...
That's what it requires.
It does. It requires a lot from you.
Yeah. Do you think that the value there, obviously, is that you do get that firsthand knowledge?
Yes, and like for me, I just love it. I love my work. I love understanding the truth, like being able to be with Kuleba and Rustem, etc., during like these critical points, and just watching the day-to-day unfold. You have an understanding of this war, of this conflict, of the multiple sides to it, and nothing is black and white. And I have, even with the Alexei, with Navalny, sitting there in the Black Forest for those days, and knowing them so well, you just understand things in a different way, in a deeper way than, I don't know. And that, for me, is super fulfilling.
No doubt, no doubt.
I mean, I'm sure that's what drives you as a journalist as well. It's just like having these conversations, having these intimate understanding of different perspectives, And I've always been someone who loves different perspectives, because I grew up that way. Like I lived in Asia, I lived in Canada, Japan, all these cultures that you had to sort of assimilate into. And that for me is life, really. Like when it doesn't necessarily mean I agree with all the perspectives, but just being able to see different perspectives is super fulfilling.
What was most surprising to you in making Hollywoodgate? The scenes where they are in the gym.
I would say, the gym, for sure.
Yeah.
But
high on the unintentional comedy scale.
Yeah, exactly, unintentional comedy scale. But I think just how deep the ignorance is, also. Around their vision, their definition of women, and women's society around women, and just their narrative around the world, even. It's just, they have had zero exposure to, what's happening outside that little bubble.
For filmmakers, you're there for a long time. Mm-hmm. How does timing work?
Yeah, and then, it's so key. Like, for example, we had to put out Hollywoodgate in an election year.
Yeah.
Which was difficult, because it sort of shows a critical look at what happened around the pullout, which then everyone ends up blaming Biden for. So then people are afraid to...
The politicizing of the film.
The politicizing of the film, but it has nothing to do with Biden. This is a problem that was created over 20 years with
multiple
4
administrations.
2 Democratic, 2 Republican.
Yes.
And it's like, we just need to look at this as a whole and as a country, as an American citizen, it's my responsibility to question our foreign policy.
Yeah.
And yet, like, you know, people are so afraid that it would be, you know, looked at as troublesome for Biden, and that's just the wrong lens to look at it through.
Do you think that
it is very difficult?
No,
I think it is. It really is. That problem was created by 4 different administrations.
Yeah.
They all equally hold the burden, and they, you know, should have communicated and come together to create a different solution there. Not each new administration coming in and creating their own goals, right?
Yeah. What do you want audiences to walk away with from Hollywoodgate?
Well, I think Hollywoodgate walks this fine line of, you see the Taliban that are, you know, in the Western media, we've spent 20 years pushing one narrative of them, which is just problematic, and these killers that are just living in caves and they're just killing and killing, killing. And then you see in the Taliban in Hollywoodgate that they also eat, they also sleep, they also are funny, they're
human.
kind of weird. They're human, right?
Yeah.
And so at the same time, not apologizing for them, not saying like, okay, wait, just not trying to humanize, but at the same time seeing that they are humans, looking at this and going, okay, hold on a second. Maybe we should try a different approach, right? Because they're obviously just deeply uneducated, are a product of 40 years of war, that have only lived in caves and been taught war, and grown up with war, fed war.
Yes.
Right? And is there something else that we can do? Is there some other approach that we can take?
Yeah. Desiree, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Irene, thank you so much for joining Al Arabiya. I want to kick off by asking you to sort of walk me through how you view your role within NATO, because women today are under pressure in various parts of the world and, frankly, in the West.
So first of all, thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to have this moment of exchange about a very important topic, not only women in NATO, but I would say on women across the globe and about our rights and the general pushback, I would say, that we are facing today. The role I have at NATO, I'm the NATO Secretary General Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security, is not new. I'm the 4th Special Representative. The position was established in 2012. But after 12 years, I have to say that despite the progress that we have made within the alliance, there is still much to do. Of course, the work I do within NATO is around the mandate of the alliance. So it's specific about the role of women and peace and security. So we do not cover other issues. But of course, what we do contributes to advancing gender equality. And it is also stated in our latest strategic concept, endorsed in Madrid in 2022, that advancing gender equality is a reflection of the common values of the alliance. So what I do is really to look at everything that the alliance does to make sure that gender perspectives are included. What does this mean? It means that every time we take a decision, both at political and a military level, we have to make sure that we consider the diversity of the population. Population is made by half by men and the other half by women, so we cannot take decisions without considering that security is perceived in a different way by men and women.
No doubt. How concerned are you when you see President-elect Trump's pick for defense saying that women shouldn't be in combat roles?
This is a topic that has been discussed over the decades around the globe. The hope was that we had overcome the barriers, the cultural barriers. Certainly, we have overcome the legal barriers. So everywhere across allies and also in our partners countries, women are part of the armed forces. In different extents, I would say across NATO allies, we have an average of 12%. So if we look at the population, as I said, 50% made by women, there is still a big gap to cover this percentage. I think that we still have a lot of work to overcome cultural barriers and change the mindset. We are not all at the same stage. So this conversation will certainly be put at the table, but there is a general consensus that women have to be part of the military forces. And we have proof that nowadays, if we look at Ukraine, how incredible women are fighting now on the front line. Since the full-scale invasion, a lot of women have joined voluntarily, and that's very important to say, that they were not obliged to do it. They are around 60,000 now in the armed forces. More than 40,000 are civilians, but the rest are military, and 5,000 are fighting on the front line alongside with their male colleagues.
If the United States rolls back women's role in the military, and I mean in combat positions, does that weaken the NATO alliance and the NATO mission?
I'm not expecting this change to happen. Of course, I'm expecting maybe some conversation around this, but there is a consensus. There are policies in place. This year, in Washington, this year, in our big yearly summit, we endorsed a new women, peace and security policy. When we endorse a policy, 32 allies come together and they agree on what is on the policy.
Including the United States.
Including.
Yeah.
Indeed, and this lasts for 5 years. And the policy states very clearly that increasing participation of women in all peace and security efforts, both on the diplomatic and in the military side, is what we have to do if we want to enhance our operational effectiveness. Yeah. And this is where my work leads, to the implementation of this policy that will be translated next year in a new action plan. We are working on it. And this is where I will concentrate my efforts.
Yeah. Talk to me about this. You mentioned Ukraine and the role of women there in combat positions that they've taken on as an act of necessity. There's a lot of conversation, of course, about how that war may come to a conclusion. In your mind, are women better prepared to take on roles not just in the military now, but also in government in Ukraine?
I think as historically we have seen how wars change the role of women within the society. They open up different possibilities because men go to the front line. In this case, the front line is both physical and also on the space, because we see the war in Ukraine played on the hybrid space and cybersecurity, but also with very old technique on the front line. Women have filled the position in Ukraine as they did in the past during the First World War and Second World War. We see incredible women in politics at governmental level. We see women on the front line and covering all roles in the society. Even in the defense industry recently, women have stepped up and take more positions. So I think this has worked as an accelerator for the society, and I expect that women will continue to play an important role in the resolution of the conflict and in the post-conflict era, where we hope a just peace will happen soon, and we will see women to continue to take their important position.
When are we going to see a NATO Secretary General who is a woman? Because I know that was something that was mooted at the time, at the last round of conversations about this.
There was a lot of conversation about this. We need to find the best candidates. I will always say there are some requirements, and requirements are that the Secretary General has to be a former Prime Minister or President. And this is where the conversation has to be broader.
Yes.
Because the point is, why don't we have more women in politics covering this position? Because automatically then we could have more candidates for the position of the Secretary General. So now we have just welcomed our new Secretary General, Mark Rutte, but as you might heard, this week he announced a Deputy Secretary General, who is a woman and from North Macedonia, and she will join us in supposedly a few weeks. And she's the second one in the history, so it's already a progress. And I think maybe next one could be.
Could it be Giorgia Meloni?
You read in my mind, because the conversation we had It's also about the South and the rotation. You know, in alliance,
Exactly.
we're trying to rotate, and sometimes, I mean, we see a tendency to have a Secretary General coming from the northern countries, and there was a conversation about the South, but the requirements didn't come together. So one option could be to change the requirements, and the other is to see more prime minister in the South. So, of course, Giorgia Meloni could be a candidate in the future.
Walk me through this. Today, the rest of this region continues to reel over what we've seen happen in Afghanistan, and I'm talking about the subjugation of women and girls. Obviously, that was an area of serious concern for NATO, and when coalition forces were there. In your mind, what is the responsibility of NATO today to those women that we promised a future and then abandoned?
That's a difficult conversation to take. You know that NATO operates under mandates, and when we operate out of our area of responsibility, we do based on resolution of the United Nations Security Council. We withdraw, the mission is over. So as an alliance, we do no longer have a responsibility there collectively because we are no longer present. But of course, allies, individually, bilaterally, and in different contexts such as
and
the
as
United
human
Nations.
beings.
Yes, and they continue to provide support. The situation is very worrisome. There are no words to describe what happened. And I think that individually, as I said, a human being and with our respective roles at national level, we have to continue to speak out about what is happening there and to fight for women's rights, because the silence will really put them, you know, in a we will forgive about them, even if we don't do. But in the global conversation, you see, if you read the newspaper, it doesn't really come on the news so often.
What do you think is the solution there in your mind? Because obviously there is an ability of nations who are giving aid to Afghanistan to exert pressure on them.
If I could have a solution, you know, I would try to put this, implement it. I found that extremely difficult. What I'm doing on my side is to continue dialogue with women from Afghan and see if there is a way to support. One of the focus is always how to train women to create space for dialogue for them in terms of dialogue also with the Taliban or mediation processes. And I know that there are several women who are also present in Doha a few years ago that continue the dialogue and try also to train younger generation to make sure that they will have the possibility to play a role and to exercise their right.
When you come to a forum like this one, based in the United Emirates, a country that has promoted women not just to positions in government, also mandated their participation on boards in the private sector, are you encouraged by what you see and how the region is evolving?
Indeed, I am very much. I'm very happy to be here and to have the opportunity to engage in person, because I think this is the best way when then you have a concrete example that you can share. When people ask me, what do you do? It's difficult to explain then if you don't have stories to tell. And changing the narrative is what we absolutely have to do. So it's a very positive example, and I'm really looking forward to attending the forum tomorrow.
Tell me this, what is missing in your mind from the global dialogue for women? Because when we speak about this from a business perspective, we talk about quotas and we talk about a number of women on boards. One woman feels alone, 2 women has a friend, and then 3 women can make a change. But in your mind, from a governance perspective, from a security perspective, what needs to change?
I think it's a question of the cultural change I was mentioning earlier. And it's about gender, what we call gender-responsive leadership. We focus a lot on the participation of women, but we still find resistance, cultural barriers. And sometimes women are there because government decide to do, and then speak at global level, not referring to the local situation. But at the end, there is no real willingness to integrate. So it's more a token than a reality. So I think that what we have to look is the change of mindset of who is in power today, which in the normality are men. So we have to look into what we call the gender-responsive leadership to say that to train, to dialogue with both men and women together to understand the benefit that the entire society will have if women take on more position at high level. It's not for women, it's not helping women to do something, you know, when they say, I'm helping my wife. No, it's not about this, because in the moment where the dynamic changes, men will benefit from this different dynamic. They will have more time for the children. They have more time even for discussion and conversation, not under the pressure. And the solution that will be found will be better solution, because they will really bring the perspective of the entire society. So this topic of the gender responsive leadership is something I advocated for, and I put as a first goal of the new policy at NATO, because I think that in a male-dominated environment, while we work to increase the number of women, we have also to work with the men who are present to make sure that we can reach the same high-quality solution in a shorter time.
Bring them with us.
Yes.
Irene, it's great to have you here at Al Arabiya. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson, and coming up on today's programme, nearly 2 weeks on from the toppling of Bashar al-Assad, the UN is calling for elections in Syria. Meanwhile, Turkey suggests removing the HTS group from terror lists. The Houthis say that Israeli airstrikes on Yemen will not deter them from supporting the people of Gaza. Meanwhile, Israel says whoever strikes us will be hit sevenfold. During his annual address, the Russian President Vladimir Putin says he's ready to speak any time with the US President-elect Donald Trump about the war in Ukraine. And as the drone saga in the United States continues, President Joe Biden's attempts to reassure the public don't seem to be having the desired effect. We'll be speaking to 2 mayors in New Jersey to get their take. Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin in Syria, where the United Nations is calling for, quote, free and fair elections. This a few weeks after the Assad dynasty was toppled. Well, the United Nations Special Envoy for Syria, Geir Pedersen, says that there must be a new constitution, inclusive political engagement, and elections that include all Syrians. This in line, he says, with Resolution 2254. Well, Turkey, meanwhile, has suggested that the United Nations and the international community remove the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham group from its terror list. Well, HTS is an offshoot of al-Qaeda, and the group has been sanctioned by the United States and by the UK. Well, they were behind the Lightning Offensive, which led to former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad fleeing to Russia earlier on this month. Well, the leader of HTS, Ahmad al-Shara, is trying to reassure the world that his armed group does not pose a threat to Syria's neighbours or to the West. Well, speaking to the British broadcaster, the BBC, al-Shara asked that sanctions be lifted since the HTS, quote, has not committed crimes that justify calling them a terrorist group. Well, he added that the victim and the oppressor must not be treated in the same way. Well, for an outlook on what post-Bashar al-Assad Syria is facing, we're joined now by the former British ambassador to Syria, Henry Hogger. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Great to have you with us once again on Al Arabiya News. I just want to start by asking you for your thoughts on what Ahmad al-Shara has been saying to the British media.
Yeah, well, good morning, I think, for you. Yes, I heard the interview that al-Shara gave to Jeremy Byrne last night, and I agree, I think, with what you were saying, that he seemed to be taking considerable pains to show that his organisation, HTS, is no longer what we would call a jihadi or certainly terrorist organisation, that it is wants to be inclusive and bring all Syrians into the new government, and you referred to earlier to elections. They have said that they want to do elections within, I can't remember, I think it's 3 months or so. All that is the right noises. Obviously, it's important to see what happens in reality on the ground. But I certainly don't detect so far any signs other than that they do genuinely want to establish an inclusive and, one would hope, democratic government based on a constitution, as the UN envoy has requested.
Yeah, indeed. They've been saying, haven't they, all along, judge us on our actions, not just by our words. And we've had about 2 weeks to judge their actions. I'm wondering, I mean, it doesn't sound like there's anything you've seen or heard that's made you draw anything other than a fairly favourable conclusion?
I think that's right. I mean, I obviously don't have any sort of on-the-ground information that's any more than others who are in touch with the media. But I was interested to hear this morning that the new UN humanitarian coordinator, Tom Fletcher, who of course is a former ambassador and foreign policy official at Number 10, saying that he's actually been all over, well, in several different parts of the country, talking to ordinary Syrians on the ground of all different sort of complexions and origins, and that the impression he comes away with from that is that so far at least there's a willingness by most people to give the new order the benefit of the doubt. No doubt partly because for most of those people, I guess anything is better than what they had before, which was where they had no personal security, where people were detained and executed more or less at will and all that. So it can only be an improvement on the ground thus far. But I'm sure, like outside observers, that many of those people will be waiting rather cautiously to see whether the HTS Leopard has actually really changed its former jihadi spots, if I put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, some countries sounding extremely cautious. For example, the Israeli Deputy Foreign Minister described HTS as wolves in sheep's clothing. And then yesterday, I interviewed Donald Trump's pick for counter-terrorism envoy, and he said that these kinds of organizations never change, and he suggested it was naive to believe that they might do. So it does sound, doesn't it, like not everyone is being quite as generous in their assessment of HTS as perhaps you and some of the Europeans.
Well, I think that's right. But I mean, taking Israel, for example, I mean, they've hardly been helping in any way to allow what I call the new Syria to get off to a good start by a succession of air attacks on various military facilities on the Syrian fleet base in Tartus and so on. And as I understand it, by trying to take more ground up in the Golan, the area that they already occupy. So, you can hardly say that's been positive. As for the comment by Mr. Trump's spokesman, well, I'm not sure if I agree that these organizations never change their spots. I mean, it can go both ways, but I certainly know of at least individuals who have been very firm adherents to jihadi-type Islamist militant organizations who have become very respected advisors, including in some cases in Britain and to former British governments. So I think they can change. I certainly don't disagree with being cautious, and the issue of what you call it, delisting them from the list of terrorist organizations is a very sensitive one, and I'm not in any position to advise it one way or the other. What I do think, by the way, though, is that despite all that, there is definitely a case for an early and major injection of humanitarian aid on the ground in Syria, because there are all sorts of consequences that will flow from not providing that.
Yes. Yeah, in fact, I was going to ask you about that right this moment, because obviously there is a serious humanitarian crisis there in Syria. We were talking to David Miliband, the CEO of the IRC yesterday, saying, there's a grave humanitarian situation, and there's an argument therefore, isn't there, going back to what we were saying earlier, for talking to whoever is in power in the interests of making sure that aid is distributed in an effective way.
Absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think it's interesting that both David Miliband and Tom Fletcher, who I was mentioning earlier, have very considerable diplomatic and political experience, as well as their current humanitarian roles. I would expect them, therefore, to realise that there is actually a political case for bringing in humanitarian aid. First of all, doing so doesn't necessarily imply any judgment on recognition or acceptance of the authority that you're dealing with. There's plenty of other places around the world where humanitarian aid is being supplied, even with some very much nastier regimes in charge, in order to try and get to the ordinary people who suffer from those regimes. So the political point is clear, and I think there's another one related to that, which is that the longer a country like Syria now is left desperate, destitute, because of the way that the regime ran down its economy and the conflict and so on, the more young people you've got out there who've got no jobs, who've got no prospects, and are a fertile recruiting ground for what I call the real terrorist organizations, who, of course, the more people they recruit, the greater a threat they pose to us in the West.
So you're saying there's a correlation between the lack of any opportunity, the lack of any kind of prosperity, and indeed a desperate humanitarian situation, and the likelihood that people could be pushed in the direction of extreme ideologies?
Well, I think that's not just an opinion from me. I think you look at recent history, movements like Hamas, like Hezbollah. I think most people recognise grew out of poverty, lack of opportunity, unemployment, and all those other things in the occupied territories in case of Hamas, and in Lebanon and so on with Hezbollah. So I don't think, as I say, I don't think it's a judgment simply by me. I think it's I think that correlation is proven historically.
There are lots of countries weighing up whether or not to remove HTS from their list of terror organizations. Turkey saying it's considering doing that. And I mean, it looks from the outside that Turkey is shaping up to be one of the significant countries in terms of, the shape that Syria is going to take moving forward. I mean, I wonder if you agree with that. Which other countries do you think are shaping up to be influential in the direction that Syria goes in?
Well, I think it depends what you mean by influential. I already mentioned Israel. I think it's being influential in a probably rather negative way. But I'm not an expert on Turkey. But the only thing I'd say is that I think it's clear that they have been a major sponsor of the authority more or less run by HTS in Idlib in the northwest of Syria, obviously on the border with Turkey there. And I think that Erdogan probably sees them as a buttress against the influence of the Kurds, who run the area further along to the east, most of the northeastern part of Syria. He's only glad to have such a buttress because of his fears about the knock-on effect on Kurdish separatists in Turkey itself. And I think also probably, Erdogan is broadly speaking of what you might call a mild Islamist bent, and therefore he may find that the ideology of HTS, suits him rather well, and that's the sort of current he'd like to see coming to the fore in his neighbouring country.
I mean, the Kurds you mentioned there, they do pose a bit of a dilemma to Syria's new leaders. What's going to happen to them, and not just them, but the other armed factions that are operating in Syria? I mean, how do you see them being integrated into the next chapter of Syria?
Well, all I can say, Tom, is I'm quite glad I don't have that problem to deal with myself, because it's going to be difficult. The result of all these years of conflict is that the Syrian population is probably one of the most heavily armed in the world. There are guns in not necessarily every household, but a lot of them. And there are, as you say, all these different more minor sects, some of which have been present in Idlib itself in that sort of provisional administration. The Kurds are a problem, as you say. it may be that the Turks have a down on the Kurds, but on the other hand, the Americans have been supporting them very strongly, primarily as a source of support in tackling the remains of ISIS and Al Qaeda up in that part of Syria. So I mean, yeah, it's extremely complicated, and I think that the new leadership is going to. I mean, they're making the right noises, but I think they're going to have some real challenges to tackle in trying to weld the country, as we all hope, into some kind of coherent and, as I said earlier, more or less democratic country run on the basis of constitutional legitimacy.
Yeah, while you were talking, we were looking at some pictures of Syria, the latest pictures on the ground. Some of them show the airport, flights taking off once again from Damascus International Airport. So a sign of some sort of a return to normalcy for the country. But I mean, there is another risk for the new leadership in Syria. We've already talked about these different factions. There are these external influences, such as Russia, such as Iran, such as Hezbollah, that don't want to see this new leadership succeed. I mean, I'm just wondering what can be done to mitigate the chances of interference on their part.
Well, the players that you're talking about are not ones that we in the West really have a great deal of leverage over, to be honest. I think as Iran, perhaps, there may be a bit of sort of self-fulfillment in that they have taken such a battering with the more or less demise of Hezbollah and Hamas, at least militarily. So they've lost a lot of their stooges in the Arab world. If they've got any sense that regime, which is, after all, under internal pressure too from dissident movements and so on, they'll draw their horns in a bit and stay back on the sidelines. And Russia too, I mean, they've had a bloody nose from all this because their protege in Damascus is now probably not very welcome guest within their own country. And of course, they've got a lot of other things to worry about with Ukraine and their efforts to interfere now in other European countries, Georgia and Romania and so on. So I think they've got quite a lot of other things to worry about. It's, I hope, not too wishful thinking that they too will sort of sit back and take a bit of a back seat rather than trying to stir things up too violently for the new disposition in interest. And there is one thing that, I mean, Russia doesn't benefit either from a resurgence of Islamist terrorism, as you know. I mean, they've had enough of that kind of trouble in their own within their own sphere of influence over the last few years. So I'm not sure if they'll want to push too hard against the efforts to settle things down within Syria.
Just lastly, I mean, we're talking here about Syria, a country you know well. You served there almost 25 years ago as ambassador. It's a country that's been scarred by decades of torture. There's been disappearances, summary executions, 70% of the population now living in need of aid. How long do you think it's going to take for a country with that amount of baggage to heal and reconstruct?
Well, I think it's going to take a long time. I wouldn't like to put a timescale on it, but as you say, those scars run very deep. I was very lucky to be posted in Syria 20 years ago when there wasn't conflict, when it was, in fact, a wonderful country to explore because of the generosity and hospitable nature of the ordinary people. And I don't think that's changed very much. But of course, what has happened is that different factions have been set against each other. This is against the background, historically, in fact, of a very tolerant society that grew up with coexistence among Jews, Christians, Muslims of different sects, and so on. But one would love to see things going back gradually to that state of affairs, but it's not going to be a quick business. And I would just like to say, sort of in relation to that, there's a slight tendency with some European governments, including our own now, to say, well, it's done and dusted. Syrians can all go back. The refugees we've got in our countries can all go back now because it's perfectly safe and et cetera, et cetera. Well, of course it isn't. And it isn't going to be for quite a while, and certainly not economically viable to go back and try and make a living there. So I think my plea is just, let's not push our Syrian guests out too abruptly, because let's give them a little bit of opportunity to assess for themselves what the prospects are if they do go back.
OK, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time once again. Henry Hogger, thank you. In other news, the Palestinian group Hamas has reacted to Israel's strikes in Yemen today, calling them, quote, a dangerous development. This after Israel struck ports and energy infrastructure in Yemen after intercepting a missile attack by the Houthis. Well, the Israeli attack, involving 14 fighter jets and other aircraft, came in two waves. The first series of strikes on the port of Salif and Ras Isa, and the second series hitting the capital Sana'a. Well, the Yemeni Houthis were launching attacks on international shipping in the Red Sea corridor. They've been doing that since November of last year, in what they say is solidarity with the Palestinians in Gaza. Well, in response to missile attacks by the Houthis, Israel is threatening more attacks on Yemen. The Israeli defense minister says, quote, whoever strikes us will be hit sevenfold.
I suggest to the leaders of the Houthis in Yemen to see, understand, and remember, whoever raises a hand against the state of Israel, his hand will be cut off. Whoever strikes us will be hit sevenfold. We will strike with force, and we will not allow the continuation of the situation of firing and threats against the state of Israel.
Well, we're joined now by Charles David Freilich, the former Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor. Thank you so much for joining us, Chuck. I just want to ask you, first of all, why Israel is carrying out these airstrikes on Yemen. And as an extension of that, what do you read into the choices of target?
Well, I think the answer is pretty self-evident. The Houthis have been regularly launching ballistic missiles and UAVs, drones, at Israel ever since the war began, and were already beginning to impose a maritime blockade against Israel, I believe even before the war began. Now, Yemen is 2,000 kilometers away from Israel, so there is no reason for this other than the fact that the Houthis, who control part of Yemen, are a radical Islamist organization, and whose one of their basic goals is to bring about Israel's destruction. So this is really a matter of self-defense, and Israel has already responded on a couple of occasions. So far, it hasn't succeeded in deterring the Houthis. We'll see if this round does. The targets were basic national infrastructure, such as ports, electric facilities, partly because it's just too hard to find all the Houthi fighting forces, which are dispersed and hidden all around Yemen. So for lack of choice, that's really what leads to the choice of targets.
Obviously, Israel has been extremely focused militarily on what's been happening in Gaza, also what's been happening in Lebanon, to a certain extent what's been happening in Syria, and also in Iran. I'm just wondering, do you expect perhaps as the focus moves away from Lebanon and Gaza, where there could be a ceasefire deal, we don't know, but in the days ahead, could there be a shift in focus now towards Yemen, do you think?
Well, I think there could be something of a shift, but I don't think that what kept Israel from responding more significantly until now was the ongoing fighting on the other fronts. It was a hope that maybe more limited responses and international responses might do it. Unfortunately, the international response has been quite limited, although the U.S. did launch a limited attack on the Houthis, I believe it was yesterday. Yemen is very, very far from Israel. It's not like Gaza or Hezbollah in Lebanon, where flight time is maybe a couple of minutes, if that. This is far away. It's about as far as the outer limits, let's say, of Israel's capabilities. Launching an operation such as this is even if it's not a big attack, it's a big operation because of the distances, the need for refueling, command and control aircraft, intelligence aircraft, the rescue aircraft. So it's a big deal. We'll see. Israel may now decide to respond more significantly, more regularly. But I think the hope at least is still that maybe the Houthis will decide not to continue.
Obviously, Iran has had quite a number of setbacks, as have Iran-linked groups and interests in the last few weeks and months, notably the degrading of Hezbollah, the toppling of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And I'm just wondering how that's been felt, how you perceive that to have been felt by the Houthis. I mean, do you think this has made something of a difference to how they view their strength and how they can flex their muscles in the region?
Well, I think there is a certain maybe gloating on their part, a sense that they're the only ones who have so far successfully withstood Israel's responses. I think it's a degree of overconfidence which they may come to regret.
Yemen is obviously feeling the effects of a profound economic crisis, one of the worst humanitarian disasters in the world. And I'm just wondering whether that as well is meaning that the Houthis are under domestic pressure for bringing about such misery for the people that live there.
One would think so, and one would hope so, but the Yemeni economic crisis has actually been going on for many decades, and certainly for the last decade. So I don't think it's directly related to the war. One could make the argument that one of the ways that the Houthis might want to address it is by directing domestic opinion externally, diverting people's attention from their domestic difficulties. I don't imagine that that's a significant reason for what's going on, or whether it will have too much of an impact on Yemeni public opinion.
Just lastly, Chuck, I mean, I'm interested to know, I mean, the Houthis have said since the 7th of October that they're operating in solidarity with the Palestinians. And I'm just wondering whether you see here the automatic de-escalation or the automatic end to hostilities with Yemen if a ceasefire deal in Gaza is indeed struck.
Well, first of all, we have to see that the deal is struck. We've faced periods of heightened optimism numerous times in the last year plus, unfortunately. Maybe this time, hopefully, it'll prove different. If the Houthis really mean that their attacks were related to the Gaza war, then logically your question would lead to the conclusion that yes, they will stop firing at Israel, and that will lead to an immediate ceasefire. I hope that's the case. I hope they haven't become too enamored of their role as the last standing force in the axis of resistance. And they do have an ideological commitment to Israel's destruction. We'll see. It's early to say. Hopefully that might make a difference.
All right, Chuck Freilich, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you.
Thank you.
In other news, the Russian President Vladimir Putin says he's ready to compromise with the US President-elect Donald Trump with regards to the war in Ukraine. Well, when he was asked about what he might be able to offer Trump, Putin dismissed an assertion that Russia was in a weak position, saying that Russia had got much stronger since he ordered troops into Ukraine in 2022.
What can I offer to the President-elect Trump when we meet? First of all, I don't know when we will meet because he doesn't say anything about it. I haven't spoken to him for more than 4 years, and I am ready for it. Of course, at any time, and I will be ready for a meeting if he wants it. You and the people who pay your wages in the U.S. would be very much like Russia to be in a weakened position. I have a different point of view. I believe that Russia has become much stronger over the past 2 or 3 years. Why? Because we are becoming a truly sovereign country. We are no longer dependent on anyone.
President Putin speaking there at his annual year-end phone-in and news conference. Well, he's also been accusing Ukraine of terrorism, following on from the murder of the Russian general Igor Kirillov, who was killed in an explosion outside a Moscow apartment building on Tuesday. Well, Russia said yesterday it had detained an Uzbek man who'd confessed to planting and detonating the device on the instructions of Ukraine's SBU security service.
You said it was an assassination. I'm grateful to you for this because you indirectly acknowledged that this is a terrorist act. Why? Because this is a murder committed in a way that is dangerous for the lives of many people. The regime in Kiev has repeatedly committed such crimes, terrorist attacks against many citizens of the Russian Federation.
Well, President Putin was asked about all these various issues at an annual year-end phone-in and news conference. Well, for more, we can speak to Abbas Galyamov, who's a former speechwriter for the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to ask you about this annual year-end phone-in and news conference. I'm just wondering how closely watched it is there in Russia.
Well, I watched all this a little more than 4 hours.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah, I watched it for the whole event, almost more than 4 hours.
What sort of viewership does it have? I mean, is it something that everyone in Russia tunes in and watches?
Not now. Look, when he just came, when he started this program, yes, it was extremely popular. But now, 25 years after, no, few people really, few people believe that he'll tell something interesting or he'll change something. Like, people got accustomed to that. Well, yes, he can speak, he can promise, he's explaining everything nicely, but nothing is changing for the best in life, actually. Everything is changing from bad to worse. And so people are kind of disappointed.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I mean, sometimes during these phone-ins, I'm told, although I don't understand what's being said because I don't speak Russian, but people call in, they ask questions that can be sometimes a little bit uncomfortable for the president to answer. Do people remain cautious, however, about what they ask him, or do people feel quite free to ask him really anything they want?
No, look, definitely Russia is not a free country now at all. Even 25 years ago, when it was pretty democratic, there was still the feeling of discipline. Like, this is a national leader. You cannot feel free, feel at ease with him. He's not just like a chap, old pal, or your classmate whom you can talk anything about. Of course, it was not like it was never like this. Everyone had the feeling that he's like a big deal. And now, when we have not authoritarian, almost totalitarian state, you should understand what is happening in Russia. Well, in this case, of course, everyone is afraid to say something which he wouldn't like. And actually, you should understand that this event is no longer free from the point of view of who are calling and who are talking to him. It's a pre-organized event with predetermined questions. It's all staged up. Almost nothing. Like 95% of the questions asked, they were controlled by his press officers. Just several questions might be relatively free, and when they give floor to BBC or some other independent Western journalists, yes, those are free to ask anything, including something unpleasant for Putin. But basically, Putin knows what they're going to ask. So just a few questions which are not controlled by Putin's office, like this.
Yeah, I mean, you've painted the picture of someone who's changed quite a lot over the years. That was the impression I was getting from your answer in the early part of it. And even by President Putin's own admission, one of the things that stood out for me is that he said that he jokes and laughs much less than he used to. I think he was saying this with regards to the war in Ukraine ongoing now and entering its fourth year, I should say. What do you read into this? What's your interpretation of why he said that? Do you think he is a much changed man?
I think he doesn't care for people being killed, but he's a good actor, and he understands what to say and how to behave. So he understands that he should show like respect and being sorry with regard to all these people being killed, because like if he doesn't do it, he's out of touch with the country. You should understand that he's losing popular support now, like at speed which is constantly growing, and if he starts adding to this speed by doing such blunders like showing that he doesn't care, well, he doesn't want to do this. So it's just staged up. It's just the matter of game. If he really cared for these people, he wouldn't have been doing what he is doing, because there are no objective reasons why there should be war.
We're going to talk a bit more about some of the content in the speech in just a moment, but I just want to ask you, since you wrote speeches for President Putin, I don't know how close your working relationship was, perhaps you can tell us, but what was it like working for him and writing speeches for him? Did he tend to stick to the speech, or would he go off script? Tell us a bit about him.
No, when I worked for him, I worked for him all in all 3 years, for 3 years, 1 year when he was president and 2 years when he was prime minister. So last time it was 2010, so it was pretty long ago. At that time, he was not sticking to the speech, to the script at all. If he felt that he was just opening the text and beginning to read it, and then if he wanted to add something, he would pick up his eyes. It's visible, actually. He's picking up his eyes. He starts speaking. Then he's coming back to the speech and speaking. Sometimes he's reading a little, then putting it aside and starts speaking. If he feels that he knows what he wants. So he's in this respect, he's quite able speaker. So it's not that he needs a written text for all the time. Basically, he needs it just to start, to set the train moving, and maybe to read while he's in the car going to the event. He has this text there in the car waiting for him, so he's maybe going through it, checking the facts, and getting the ideas which he wants to express, and then he's speaking off the hand, freely, fluently.
Okay, so you're saying he's a gifted public speaker in Russian. He works hard and he's diligent on the speech. Now, going back to the content, he talked about Ukraine quite considerably. He talked about Ukraine. He talked about the fact that he is ready, quote, any time for talks with the incoming US President Donald Trump. He also talked about how he's ready for negotiations and compromises. He's sounding a lot more conciliatory, isn't he, than he was perhaps a year ago?
Well, the objective situation is that he needs to finish this war. In spite of his troops moving forward, the tensions, the strain, they are really hard. It's not only about the battlefield where his army is going through tremendous losses, and he really is lacking people now. Soon there would be no people for him to continue his advancement. But it's not only about this, it's about weaponry. His officials responsible for producing weapons, they are speaking that in current economic situation, they would all soon go bankrupt. Chemezov, the head of Rostech, the chief producer of the Russian arms, Russian weaponry, he spoke in the upper chamber of the Russian Parliament, Federation Council, something like two months ago, and he told that even export of weaponry is the most profitable industrial undertaking which you can imagine, is already becoming, under current financial situation, is already becoming unprofitable. So he's publicly telling that soon the whole industrial complex would collapse. So, of course, it's being told not like when you're speaking to officials, and not like on this widely broadcast propaganda channels like today's event. But still, people speak about this. So it's people, it's weapons. Like the population is exhausted. People really want this to stop. There is no longer support for any war. People just want normalization. They want to come back to pre-war period. This is just their dream. Like the economy is crumbling, foreign policy, like he couldn't save Assad, which was his chief ally in the Middle East. His whole Middle Eastern policy just failed. Now it's in ruins because everything was everything came to Syria. Everything was based on tied up around Syria, and now Syria is the country where his chief ally is lying in ruins. So he cannot continue this for a long time. And you know, one more point. Trump came as an opposition to Biden, to the previous American administration. So it's a really good chance for Putin to restart relations with America and maybe try to normalize them, because the continuation of the previous this course, which was very inimical, unfriendly, like Cold War course, it definitely all the sanctions. It definitely leads towards ultimate ruin, and there is a chance to change that. So he should use this chance. Definitely, he understands it, because if he now makes enemy out of Trump, he made the enemy out of Biden. Now he cannot afford to make enemy out of Trump. So he understands that. That's why he sounds more conciliatory than before. But of course, the question is how much he can yield, because he still needs to come back to Russia from the war with something which would look like victory. He cannot afford appearing in front of the elites, of population, without victory. What you lost to Ukraine, like this will completely ruin his image of a strong man, because, you know, like for many, many years, they were creating this feeling that Ukrainians, they're some they're like subordinate nations, some artificial state, failed state, artificial nation, you know, they're definitely not competitors to us. We are like a great power. And now we cannot win them. So either they are great power or we are not.
All right.
So Putin cannot afford to come back without victory. So he has to combine these two things. Combine these two things, like not to make enemy with Trump, but then still try to get something from Trump.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Really appreciate you, though, taking the time to speak to us, Abbas Galyamov. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Bye.
Now, in recent weeks, US citizens, particularly in the state of New Jersey, have been gripped by panic over drone sightings lingering in the night skies. Well, adding to the mystery is the perception that the US government has been slow to respond, offering no clear explanation. Well, this has gone on to fuel numerous conspiracy theories. Some citizens and officials alike say they suspect the drones of being Iranian spy tools launched from so-called Iranian motherships. Others have suggested they could be extraterrestrials. Well, let's take a look at a video one person posted on X.
Someone called the cops on these lights. See, even the police, they're going crazy. Aliens are attacking.
Well, in an attempt to reassure the public, the US President Joe Biden has stated there is nothing, quote, nefarious about this drone phenomenon that's been observed along the country's east coast.
Nothing nefarious, apparently, but they're checking it all out. I think it's just one. There's a lot of drones authorized. up there. I think one started and they all got it. Everybody wanted to get in the deal. But we're following it closely. So far, no sense of danger.
US President speaking there, all amongst those from the US House Intelligence Committee who've spoken to reporters after Biden's address, was Representative Christy Houlihan, a Democrat, who reaffirmed that these drones were nothing to worry about. She also said that they were not related to foreign powers, nor, she said, did they belong to aliens, as she put it, little green men who are working on the American people. Well, despite all the attempts to reassure the US public, the Federal Aviation Administration has decided to temporarily ban all drone operations in several areas of New Jersey until the 17th of January. They say they will use deadly force against the unmanned vehicles if they believe they pose a threat to national security. Well, for more on all this, we can speak now to the Mayor of Belleville, Michael Melham, and also to Ryan Hurd, who is the Mayor of Pequannock Township. Both towns, I should add, are in New Jersey. Let me start with you, Ryan. I mean, what is the situation in your town? Are there continued sightings? Is there continued alarm?
Yes. Well, number one, thank you for having me on. Last night was a little rainy and a little cloud cover, so we really didn't see any. But the night before, on my way to the high school for our Christmas concert, I was able to see 4. So here's the issue. The residents of Pequannock, as well as the residents of this great state of New Jersey, we want answers. And that's what we expect, whether you're in New Jersey, USA, or any country in the world. You know, the residents expect that the leaders are going to reassure us, that are going to answer our questions, that the leaders have our back. And here in the township of Pequannock, we feel that that is not happening.
Okay, let's speak to Michael in Belleville. You're the mayor of that town. I mean, what we were just hearing there from Ryan, does that ring true?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, every single mayor here in New Jersey is well united. I mean, this started for us here in New Jersey 4 weeks ago. It's been about a week since all the mayors were gathered really close to Trenton, our capital, for a briefing with our state police. And we were all invited to a call with the White House on Monday where the same talking points were reiterated. You know, nothing to see here. We're seeing manned aircraft, a lot of misidentification. But it's the communication that's coming out of the White House has been concerning. I mean, we just heard our president say nothing to see here. The Intelligence Committee members had a classified briefing, and they came out and said nothing to see here. But yet our Foreign Affairs chairman in the House is basically saying that he believes it's China. And yet another congressperson from New Jersey is saying it's an Iranian mothership off our coast. We need some clear communication. The absence of truth and transparency in this matter is doing nothing but fuel social media conspiracies.
There is this theory that there's some missing radioactive material out there, and that's why these drones are hovering in the skies above areas of New Jersey. I mean, Ryan, have you heard anything about this?
You know, as the mayor of Belleville was saying, unfortunately, by not giving us answers, you start having all of these conspiracy theories. And yes, I've heard that one. I've heard things about aliens. I've heard a bunch of things. Now, I will be honest with you. New Jersey does have an issue with aliens, but that has nothing to do with drones. The issue with the drones is we know that these drones are flying overhead. They're flying over critical infrastructure. They're flying over our townships. They're flying over our families and our friends. And this has nothing to do with politics because these drones are flying over Republicans and Democrats and independent houses. They're flying over people of all races and creeds and color and the whole 9 yards. As the mayor of Belleville said, this is something that's uniting us. And as Americans, we want answers, and we're not getting those answers. We're getting the same answers. We've called media attention to this since 2 Sundays ago. So this is almost 2 full weeks, and we're literally no clearer now.
Yeah, it's dominating headlines around the world. And Mayor Melham, I want to ask you about this theory about the missing radioactive material. And I'm also wondering if you can just tell me from what you've seen, what sort of a size are we seeing here of drone? I mean, some people suggesting they're the size of SUVs.
They are. So we were on the mayor's call with the White House, and there was one mayor who stood out and spoke up and said, listen, I've had something over my house. It's 6 feet wide. It's the size of a small car. I've had it not once. I've had it twice. And yet they keep telling us that we're seeing things that we're not seeing. They keep telling us that we're misidentifying. But back to the radioactive material. So I kind of sparked this thing yesterday in an interview in New York City. So let's just split this up. It is not a theory that there's radioactive material on the loose. We are aware of that. That came from a federal agency, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Committee, on their .gov domain name. They talked about the fact that radioactive material was missing. Now, do I connect the two dots? Not necessarily. But do I believe that we do have our assets up in the sky, and since they are flying in a grid-like pattern, do I believe that they're searching and looking and potentially sniffing for something that might be considered a threat to us? I do.
So you think this sounds like some sort of act of incompetence, and someone is doing a bit of a recce to try to work out what happened to this missing radioactive material, and that's why no one's giving you clear answers. I mean, is that roughly your logic here, Mayor Melham?
I do believe, as the mayor said, we do have assets. We were told that from our state police, that we do have assets that are over our critical infrastructure. I do believe that those are ours. I lived through the Bush era threat level warnings, different color codes, and at a certain threat level, we do certain things. So it's totally plausible to think that our government has some assets over our critical infrastructure. Like my friend here, the mayor, he's got reservoirs, within his boundaries. Do I think we have assets over those infrastructures? Yes. Do I also think that we are potentially searching and sniffing for something? I do. Do I think it's in particular that particular radioactive material? Not necessarily. I do think that we are aware of a threat, and I do think that we're potentially out there looking for it. And if that's the case, that's fine. Just tell the American people. I no longer think or question who's really in charge of the drones or who owns the drones. It's more about why are they up there? These are the questions that we want from our federal government.
I'd just like to ask you, Mayor Ryan Hurd. I mean, we're hearing a lot of people in the opposition. Obviously, there's a change of administration happening in the next month in the United States, and there are a number of Republicans who are suggesting that the current administration is withholding information about all of this. And I'm just curious because I was given to understand that people in the incoming administration were party to the same kinds of intelligence briefings as people in the current administration. I don't know if people are saying anything about that in the United States and why, therefore, there should be any doubt in the minds of people in the incoming administration about what the government's saying here.
Well, we would hope that they're transparent, but the reality is the current administration in America is grossly incompetent, to say the very least, possibly even nefarious. I mean, not only are they lying to the American people, they can't even lie correctly. One hand is not talking to the other, and we're getting Kirby and Mayorkas saying different things on different days, and yet we have, New Jersey State saying, putting a presentation together and saying that if you do see a down drone, stay away from it, call 911, call the bomb squad, don't approach without a hazmat, and close off 300 feet. I mean, that's kind of scary. So that's an issue. I'm hoping, I'm pretty much guaranteed that the administration that is coming in will absolutely fix this problem. With that said, the last time that President Donald Trump was in office, there were people working against him by not giving him correct information or withholding information. So my worry is that the things will still be the same. As Americans, we have to demand better as our elected leaders. If you're an elected leader of a town in New Jersey as a mayor or a councilman or something like that, we have a responsibility to a people. Whether it's, fixing potholes, picking up garbage, whatever that is, we're on the front lines. It seems as if the higher you go up in the elected leader role, the less connected you are with the people. And they tend to forget who they work for. In America, as an elected leader, you work for the American people, not for yourself. That's the whole job. And that's why last Wednesday, when all of these mayors got together, over 180 mayors out of this great state of New Jersey, and our governor wasn't even there, that's why we were so angry. That's your job. We expect you to be there. Whether or not you're going to add anything to the conversation, there's still an expectation.
Mayor Michael Melham, what are your thoughts on what's just been said?
Absolutely. I mean, we all heard Trump speak this past week. He said that our government knows. He said very clearly that our president knows. And when he was asked point blank whether or not he was going to come to New Jersey this weekend, he said no. So these are the questions that we're seeking. We know our federal government knows. You can't tell me that we don't know what's flying just hundreds of feet above our house. We have technology in this country, greatest country in the world. They could read your driver's license number from a mile up in the sky via satellite. Probably why it's still in your pocket, by the way. There's no way they don't know what's going on, and it's time for them to come clean and tell the American people what's happening in our airspace just over our heads.
Yeah, and Mayor Michael Melham, let me stay with you for just a moment because, I mean, obviously, this isn't necessarily a new phenomenon. I'm told there are something like 8,500 drones in the air above the United States at any one time. This has become a hobby. There's lots of these bits of equipment around the place. But I mean, seeing what you're seeing in the skies above your house, above the town that you are mayor of, I mean, are you managing to sleep at night?
It's very difficult. My residents are anxious, they're concerned, they're worried, some are scared. And they, as the mayor just said, they look to us. We are the mayors on the ground here. We are closest to the people. They look to us for answers. We in turn look up to the state government, which has failed New Jerseyans, has failed us, their lack of communication. If I was the governor of New Jersey, I'd be in Washington right now demanding answers. And they're not getting the answers, which is concerning. But you're right. I mean, the facts are the facts. There's about 1 million drones here in the United States, about 800,000 drone operators / pilots. But here's what we know. We know the drones that are flying over our critical infrastructure are not emitting radio frequencies. These are not personal drones. These are not commercial drones. They're not emitting a radio frequency, which makes it very hard to down them. We can't jam them because they're not emitting radio frequencies, and our state police has told the mayors we have no idea where they're coming from and where they're landing. The fact that we can't chase these things. Our own governor said when we had a helicopter in the sky and got close to it, the lights went out and it disappeared. These are not personal drones. These are not part of that 1 million. This is clearly either a government operation or a foreign adversary. I'm on the belief that it's our government up there.
Mayor Ryan Hurd, are you encouraging people in your town to take matters into their own hands? I mean, some have suggested shooting these things down. We know that people in the United States, many people do carry arms. Is that something that people have been doing?
So first thing I want to say, absolutely in no way, shape, or form are we asking or encouraging anybody to shoot anything down. That's not what we do. Whether or not we have guns, yes, America has more guns per capita than any other place in this world, which makes America great. With that said, no, we are not going to be shooting any drones down. We are not going to be trying to catch any. We're not going to be sending up our hobby drones to try to take pictures of the drones. That is a federal government issue. Do I like them to shoot one down? Absolutely, over the ocean where nobody is and it's not going to cause any harm. The problem with any resident trying to do that is the unintended consequences. God forbid you were to shoot one down or catch one or anything, interfere with its operation, and it lands in your neighbor's house, killing 6 people. That's a big deal, and I don't want to have to report on that, and I don't want to have to deal with that. I never want that to happen. With that said, these are not class 1 or class 2 drones. So when we say drones, it's kind of like saying Kleenex. It's just a word that we're using for this. But the reality is when I say drones, a typical person is thinking about something, maybe the palm of their hands or the palm of 2 hands together. The reality is these are class 3 and class 4 drones. They're about the size of an SUV. They're much larger. As the mayor said, they are not emitting any frequency. So it's thinking as this is a mission that is pre-programmed in the drone goes off, it does its grid pattern, and then it comes back to wherever that is. We need answers. We need answers now, and we expect our government to do much better. But I expect the residents of my town not to try to take things in their own hand. With that said, unfortunately, because of the way the world is today, when you hear things about Syria, when you hear things about Ukraine, this is on mainstream media, it's on X, it's on YouTube, they see what's happening and how warfare has changed with drones. So the residents are asking, based on the size of these drones, is that something that can happen in New Jersey? And unfortunately, I have to say, that is a possibility. Now, I hope, with God's grace, it will never happen. But it's what everybody is seeing, and that is why our residents are staying up at night.
Yeah, indeed. And you're both mayors in a state that's home to several airports, Newark probably being the most famous of them to an international audience. We're hearing this report from the US Federal Aviation Administration. There's been something like a 269% increase in the number of cases of lasers being pointed at aircraft, presumably by members of the public, but we don't know that. Mayor Melham, I mean, how dangerous is this potentially?
It is, and I echo the mayor's sentiments. We are not advising residents to take the law in their own hands. Our skies, our federal airspace, if you do try and fire upon a drone, and again, a drone is considered an aircraft. If you do try and fire, it is a federal offense. That being said, here in Belleville, New Jersey, we're located in northern New Jersey. We border the largest city in New Jersey, Newark. We sit right smack in the middle of Newark International Airport airspace, as well as Teterboro Airport and the international airports of JFK and LaGuardia. We do have FBI guidance that's asking us to communicate to our residents, to inform them to stop using lasers. Pilots have reported landing and taking off. They are clearly being distracted. They have reports of pilots asking the FBI to have mayors here on the ground communicate to our residents to stop pointing laser pointers at these drones, or what they believe is a drone.
Okay, we're coming to the end. I'd just like to put that same question to Ryan Hearn, and I just want to wrap up and perhaps give you the last word here and ask you, a question that I've been wondering myself. I mean, what does it say about the United States today that so few people seem to believe what the authorities are telling them, and there's so much skepticism about what the government is and isn't saying?
Well, I'll be honest with you. This is exactly why it makes America great. Because the American people are not going to sit back and just accept what the government is telling us. That's the whole reason why this experiment that we call America is together. Our job as citizens is to challenge the government, to make sure that power is in check, to remind them that the government works for we, the people. That's the whole reason why we exist. I think this is a good thing on a couple of different ways. On one, we are challenging the government and we are showing the incompetence of our government today. And we, the people, will not stand for that. On another note, think of it like this. With these drones, if anything good is coming out of it, we have Christmas right around the corner where we're going to be celebrating with family and friends. This is something that has actually brought us together. You have the mayor of Belleville, you have the mayor of Pequannock, and you have a whole bunch of other mayors that came together asking the same question, regardless of what our background or affiliation is. You have the American people that are now looking up into the sky and they're not looking into their phones as much. It's a great way to bring people together. And that is the reason why we, the people, make America so great.
Ryan Hearn, you have had the last word. Thank you very much indeed to you. Thank you as well to Mayor Michael Melham. Great to have had you both with us.
Thank you.
That is all we have time for on today's edition of Global News Today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for a special program with the highlights of the past week.
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Al Arabiya News. I'm Joanne Syria. Before opposition forces toppled the government, Syria, a land of ancient history and cultural richness, was plunged into darkness for over a decade. What began in 2011 as peaceful protests was met with unimaginable brutality by Bashar al-Assad's regime, transforming the country into a battlefield. The toll has been devastating. More than 500,000 lives lost, millions displaced, and countless numbers of Syrians gone missing in the shadows of prisons and detention centers. Among these shadows, one of the most haunting revelations came from the Caesar files. This collection of tens of thousands of snapshots smuggled out of Syria by a defector by the name of Caesar exposed the systematic torture and killing of detainees in regime prisons. The images captured a stark reality: starved bodies, victims of brutal torture, and even children who were executed. Representing nearly 7,000 victims, these photos became undeniable evidence of crimes against humanity. But the Caesar files are more than just a collection of images. They revealed the depths of the al-Assad regime's brutality and underscored the urgent need for accountability. Caesar risked his life to gather and smuggle this evidence, but he didn't work alone. Osama Othman, known by his alias Sammy, was a close collaborator, helping to document and preserve these images at great personal risk. Together, they safeguarded evidence that not only brought global attention to the regime's atrocities, but also paved the way for the Caesar Act, a U.S. law imposing sanctions on the al-Assad regime to limit its ability to continue its war against the Syrian people. As a crucial player in this effort, Sammy helped Caesar navigate the dangers of smuggling the files out of Syria. For Sammy, this wasn't just about exposing the regime's crimes. It was about justice, about giving a voice to the victims, and ensuring that their stories would not be buried. Al Arabiya spoke to Sammy to hear his firsthand account of the risks, what happened along the way, and what he and Caesar had hoped to achieve. He also shares his thoughts on his home country after the fall of the al-Assad regime. Sammy begins by reflecting on the significance of taking on a second name or identity during the uprising, like the names Sammy or Caesar, and explains the dangers faced by those in the revolution and how adopting a second name became a means of survival, not just a symbolic act.
During the revolution, every Syrian who was part of it gained a second name, born at different stages, perhaps early in the revolution itself. For example, before Osama Othman became Sami, my colleague, a defector, turned into Caesar. This duo's story began around early 2014. As I mentioned, this isn't just about Sami and Caesar, it's about all children of the Syrian revolution, each of whom had two names, one given by their mother at birth, and another bestowed by the revolution that gave them new life. Today, the two names have merged in a crucible of victory. When you call me Osama, I turn instinctively. When you call me Sami, I also instinctively respond. This phenomenon compelled us, and all Syrians in the revolution, to adopt shields to protect ourselves and our loved ones, stemming from a decision to bear the weight of this revolution. To protect others, family and loved ones who didn't make this choice, from a criminal regime that could retaliate cruelly, even against second or third degree relatives, we had to shield ourselves behind symbolic aliases. These risks have been borne by all Syrians who took part in the revolution. We are not detached from this reality. Our identities became intertwined with these symbolic names starting in early 2014. Sami's name, for instance, may have been born in a moment of choice, but Caesar's name was born twice. Caesar was born twice. The first time Caesar was born was when he escaped Damascus and left the country in a complex process.
Rooted in personal stories and moments that marked new beginnings, he recounts how the names Sami and Caesar were chosen.
Initially, we approached this situation as a legal matter, an important case for human rights. Typically, the key witness in such cases is referred to as the Crown Witness. We deliberated for a long time over a name for this Crown Witness. Someone suggested the name Caesar. I was also asked what name I'd like to use moving forward. I thought of my dearest friend I left behind in Syria and chose the name Sami. That's how Sami came to be. As for Caesar, as I mentioned, his birth occurred twice. First with his escape from Syria, but when it comes to the question, who is Caesar? I believe only Caesar himself can answer.
But why hasn't Caesar revealed his true identity? Sami attributes this to the persistent threat posed by the Syrian regime, questioning whether anyone can truly assert that it has come to an end.
The
issue lies with the number of people who might perceive you as a threat. While the Syrian regime was indeed a danger to us, who can definitively say that the regime has fallen? Can anyone today claim that the Syrian regime is over? The Syrian regime isn't just Bashar al-Assad. It's an entire system. Thousands have blood on their hands and have violated the rights and lives of Syrians. So I wouldn't say the danger has completely disappeared. That's why revealing Caesar's true identity is a decision I leave entirely to him. I respect that completely, and I promised him, when we left Syria, that I'd protect him until the very end.
While Sami describes his escape from Syria as rather normal, Caesar's escape was filled with risks.
As for me, I left the country in a normal matter. I wasn't personally wanted by the regime, so I left through normal channels, and the families were evacuated quietly. The last person to leave was Caesar, whose escape was complicated and fraught with risks. We enlisted the help of someone we knew who had experience with such operations. At the time, there was a former member of parliament from our city named Mohammed Bomo, if I recall correctly. The process took an entire month of attempts before it succeeded, during which Caesar faced numerous dangers. I've come to believe he's far braver than I initially thought. This marks Caesar's physical birth. The first birth, of course, was before he became Caesar. There's much information about the nature of our work, the technical details of the escape, and the process of documenting evidence. However, we're still cautious about disclosing these details. We presented testimonies before courts in France and Germany, and we must prevent these details from circulating in the media.
During the interview, Sami also addresses misconceptions about the Caesar files, clarifying the actual scale of the documentation and its importance. He went on to describe working with Caesar to document the atrocities.
كلمة 55,000 صورة ليست دقيقة.
The claim of 55,000 images is incorrect. It was about 27,000 snapshots, not images, because each corpse was photographed multiple times, 4, 5, or 6 shots, depending on the condition of the body and the injuries. Therefore, there were fewer than 7,000 victims of torture, and the figure of 55,000 is entirely inaccurate and not something we use. These images are part of the case file.
هذه الصور التي خرجنا بها هي جزء من الملف. توثيق الصور كان عملية شبه يومية.
Documenting the images was almost a daily process. My close friendship with Caesar as an old friend, as well as our very close family ties, played a role. In Syria, you cannot trust someone simply because they're a classmate, a childhood friend, or even a sibling. The regime turned everyone into a complex security threat, like something out of George Orwell's 1984. This long-standing relationship between Caesar and me enabled us to work together on a near-daily basis. Caesar would return from work almost every day and provide me with some of these images, which I would save on my devices and archive.
لكي أقوم بالاحتفاظ به على الأجهزة الموجودة لدي وأقوم بأرشفته. قيصر لا يسكن في مدينة أخرى وإن
I'd like to clarify that Caesar did not live in another city. He lived in the same city. I met with him almost daily, as I mentioned, and we exchanged flash drives or other storage devices. He frequently changed his methods due to the severe risks he faced while travelling from his residence to his workplace. He had to cross 2 areas with differing military control, making him vulnerable to targeting from both sides, either as a soldier working for the regime or as someone engaging in work that, if discovered, would result in a disaster for both him and me.
لو اكتشفه النظام لكانت هناك كارثة كبيرة عليه وعلي أيضا. اتبعنا الوسيلتين معا.
We used both methods to preserve the data, ensuring its safety in case we were targeted. The city we were in was invaded by the army, and computers we owned were confiscated multiple times. Fortunately, they had nothing significant on them. We felt a heavy responsibility, not just over our lives, but for safeguarding these files.
هي مسؤولية كبيرة لا تتعلق بحياتنا وموتنا فقط.
According to Sami, very few people knew about their activities, adding that they had thought the revolution would end in just a few months.
لا طبعا أشخاص محدودين جدا هم الذين كانوا يعرفون بطبيعة ما يحصل بينهم.
Only a very limited number of people knew about what we were doing. At the beginning, we didn't plan to compile such dangerous files and smuggle them out of the country. We thought the revolution might end in 3 or 4 months, like in Egypt and Tunisia. We wanted to avoid the tragedy of 1982, where people went missing and no one knew whether they were dead or alive. So we decided to keep these images and, after the revolution, release them to the public so people could learn the fate of their loved ones, whether they'd been martyred or were missing.
نعلنها لشعبنا الكريم لكي يعرف الناس مصير أحبابهم من كان منهم قد استشهد ومن كان مفقودا حقيقة.
Sammy goes on to describe how these snapshots captured the horror of torture, highlighting what stood out the most.
الحقيقة لا أستطيع أن أقول عن صورة إنها بشعة.
Honestly, I cannot describe any of these images as horrifying. These are our martyrs, our people. We do not want to violate their privacy. You're talking about the horror of torture, the gruesome methods used. I cannot bring myself to compare or say one image shows more suffering or violation than another. However, what stood out was that some security branches consistently displayed severe starvation of detainees and victims, or instances where their eyes were gouged out. The thought of someone's eyes being ripped out while they were likely still alive, given the blood splatter around the eye socket, is haunting. I don't think you could ever see or experience a more horrible feeling than this.
هذا الأمر يعني عندما تتصوره لا أعتقد أنك يمكن أن ترى أو تعيش إحساس أبشع من هذا.
So who's the true hero here? According to Sammy, it's neither him nor Caesar.
مهما كانت الطريقة التي ينظر.
I just want to correct one thing. No matter how others perceive us, we are certainly not heroes. The true hero is the one who is martyred. It is the person in this photo. It is this file. This file is the hero. The real heroes are the mothers who lost their children, the wives and children who lost their fathers. They are the true heroes. We are merely carriers, messengers of justice, nothing more. At every stage of our work, the team would grow or shrink in number depending on the requirements of the phase, the location, and the goal we aim to achieve.
According to Sammy, there are several terms which he says are often confused when it comes to the Caesar files, adding that the Caesar Act was a byproduct of the files.
ابتداء أنا أريد التفريق بين مسميين.
First, I want to clarify the distinction between two terms that are often confused. The Caesar file pertains to victims who were killed in Syrian regime prisons under torture. These were defenseless civilians subjected to the most brutal forms of torture. The file itself has two other parts. The second part includes what the regime labels as terrorists, referring to people massacred in their homes, including children under the age of 10, and elderly individuals over 80. Yet the regime shamelessly labels these files as the elimination of a terrorist group, often claiming it consisted of 15 to 20 individuals. When you look at the photos, you see grandparents, parents, and small children. Shamelessly, the regime writes, the elimination of a terrorist group. This is the second part of the file. The third part is a collection of information that has not been revealed or discussed in the media. Together, these parts make up the Caesar file, which documents crimes against humanity and acts of genocide. These crimes do not expire with time, and no one has the right to waive accountability for the perpetrators. As for the Caesar Act, it's a byproduct of the file and a result of efforts by Syrian organizations in the United States. Our role in that effort was limited to a few visits to the US, where we met with members of Congress and other organizations and explained the atrocities committed by the regime against Syrian civilians. The distinction is clear. The file is purely Syrian, while the law is purely American. The overlap lies in their shared aim of protecting Syrian civilians and limiting the regime's ability to kill more of them.
الحد من قدرة النظام على أن يقتل أكثر من السوريين.
And describing the harrowing scenes he saw at regime prisons and centers, Sammy says al-Assad was running a killing factory.
What I can say is that the file I saw and compiled includes images of children. Yes, children. Why were they detained and killed? I cannot speculate.
The
brutality depicted in the photos is beyond imagination. It's unfathomable how the guards could carry out such horrific acts. What we've seen recently, with detainees being freed after prisons were opened by locals or authorities, represents perhaps the penultimate stage of producing these corpses, the victims of Bashar al-Assad's machinery of death. Al-Assad is running a factory of killing. The final stage is represented by the Caesar photos, where we noticed even the bodies were sometimes wrapped in nylon bags. Before that, during the initial detention and torture stages, I think what we have in the Caesar file is a very small part of the crimes that the regime was committing. The Caesar file only covers detention centers and prisons in Damascus, not all of Syria. It also spans a limited time period, from May 2011 to around August or September 2013.
تقريبا من الشهر الخامس 2011 إلى الثامن أو التاسع 2013.
While Bashar al-Assad fled to Russia, Sami calls for having the ousted president tried in Damascus by Syrian judges under a fair and just system in what he calls a free Syria.
عندما كنا نطالب
When we were calling for Bashar al-Assad to be brought to The Hague, Syria was occupied by his regime and its allies. It was a republic of fear. Despite the challenges, such as Russian and Chinese vetoes, we persisted. We turned to national courts in European Union countries that operate under universal jurisdiction. However, today Syria is free. Bashar al-Assad should be tried in Damascus by Syrian judges under a fair and just Syrian legal system. Justice should not stop with al-Assad. All of those who committed violations, whether physical or moral, must be held accountable. This must happen in Damascus as a symbol of justice for a free people who sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives.
Sami reveals to Al Arabiya not all of those involved in the described crimes were only military personnel, but included doctors and others working in the medical field.
We have information about certain officers and staff working inside these prisons, including documents showing the involvement of a doctor who examined the victims' bodies and issued falsified medical reports. These reports often claimed victims died of a sudden cardiac arrest or respiratory failure during interrogation, even when their bodies bore horrific injuries such as missing eyes, severe burns, or extreme emaciation. We also have names and photos of some individuals involved, including those working in medical services in Damascus hospitals. Not all of them are military personnel.
يعني هم ليسوا عسكريين وإنما هم يعملون في الخدمات الطبية في مشافي دمشق.
During the interview, Sami calls on Syrians not to discard any documents they may find after the fall of the government. According to him, these could be used as evidence of the atrocities committed by the regime.
What we see today in Damascus and other cities, how the archives are mishandled, is an affront to the victims' rights. We've seen documents carelessly discarded on the streets in Damascus and elsewhere. I want to remind Syrians that when Russia intervened in 2015, the revolution stagnated and the world turned away. The Caesar file isolated al-Assad economically and politically at a time when he was being rehabilitated internationally. Without it, he might now be walking red carpets in world capitals. So I urge Syrians not to discard these documents. They are critical. We have a team on the ground in Syria to collect what they can of these documents to aid us in the transitional justice period. How can you achieve transitional justice without accountability? Accountability requires evidence, and evidence depends on documents and accurate archiving. Documents handled carelessly may not be admissible in court.
ليست كل الوثائق يمكن قبولها في المحكمة إذا تم التعامل معها بهذه الطرق التي نشاهدها على الشاشات يوميا. هذا السؤال أستطيع أن أجيب عليه.
The chaos we see today in how documents are treated mirrors the disorganized release of detainees. Many of these detainees have spent decades in prison and are in poor health. Their treatment and the handling of documents must be systematic, as they are both part of the evidence. Additionally, any employee still serving under Bashar al-Assad's regime could tamper with or destroy critical documents. I urge people to be vigilant and ensure these individuals are not allowed to manipulate or destroy evidence.
فكيف نترك هؤلاء يتلفون هذه الوثائق ونعطيهم الوقت؟
Sami also reveals to Al Arabiya that public hospitals in Syria turned into human slaughterhouses under the regime during the revolution years.
في سوريا جميع مؤسسات الدولة مهما كانت صفتها هي مؤسسات أمنية أو تخضع لإشراف أمني مباشر.
In Syria, all state institutions, regardless of their official function, are either security institutions or operate under direct security oversight. For instance, even at the level of municipal councils, there's a security officer monitoring every decision in detail. Public hospitals in Syria, which turned into human slaughterhouses during the revolution, became places where victims' and injured individuals' rights were grossly violated. While I cannot cite specific cases at this moment, this applies even more to branches of the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party, which routinely submitted reports to security agencies. These branches were not serving as political organizations, but as surveillance entities.
And moving on to the Caesar Act, Sami reiterates that his team's efforts were not focused on passing the law. Instead, they were able to prevent the regime from whitewashing its image.
I want to reiterate that our team's efforts were not focused on passing the Caesar Act. That was the work of Syrian organizations, achieved through a collective effort by many groups. Our real contribution lies in the emotional and legal impact that prevented the regime from rehabilitating its image. This regime is criminal, and the genuine legal testimonies we provided to institutions like the German public prosecutor and France's war crimes unit were instrumental. These testimonies formed the foundation of the legal cases heard in European courts. Unlike testimonies before parliaments, congresses or political groups, these legal testimonies are enduring and impactful. Media testimonies may gain attention temporarily, but they do not hold the same weight or influence policy changes.
He also clarifies that the Caesar Act does not prevent the imports of essential goods, such as medication, as the regime had claimed.
Let me remind Syrians that the Caesar sanctions apply to all of Syria, not just areas under the regime's control. The dire situation in regime-controlled areas is not due to sanctions, but to the regime's corruption and economic mismanagement. The regime blames the Caesar Act for the lack of medicine and fuel, but this is untrue. The Caesar Act does not prevent the import of essential goods such as medicines, food, agricultural equipment, fertilizers or seeds. Its purpose is to limit the regime's ability to sustain its military machine used to kill Syrians. For example, the Deir Ali power plant south of Damascus receives Egyptian gas through a pipeline via Jordan, so fuel imports by sea are unnecessary. The regime's claims blaming sanctions are entirely false.
While the photos collected over the years played a significant role in holding the regime accountable, Sami reveals his and Caesar's original intentions.
لم يكن يطلع على هذا العمل سوى عدد محدود جدا من الأشخاص.
We collected these photos intending to share them with the Syrian people after the regime fell. At the time, we thought this would take only a few months. When we began, we had no plans to take these documents out of the country. Therefore, we never communicated with anyone outside the country or with individuals involved in legal affairs within the country, nor with those engaged in political affairs.
Sami explains the sensitive nature of handling the Caesar files, emphasizing the need to protect families from unnecessary trauma.
We believed that handling the Caesar file required a professional and legal approach, not a sensational or haphazard one aimed directly at families in Syria. Many families who lost loved ones cannot even recognize their relatives in these images. For instance, I kept photos of friends for years without realizing they were people I knew. Only later did I discover that they were friends who had been tortured and killed. Due to the extreme disfigurement of the victims, it's neither appropriate nor humane to distribute these images indiscriminately. Showing such photos to families could cause repeated psychological trauma, especially if the person is not their missing relative. Similarly, families who recognize their loved ones may be unable to process the horror of what they see. This requires careful handling using legal and technical methods.
هذا الأمر يجب أن يعامل بحكمة وعبر وسائل تقنية وقانونية دقيقة.
Sami stresses that the regime's remnants still pose a challenge and that achieving freedom for Syria requires justice and accountability.
الذي سقط حتى الآن في رأينا هو بشار الأسد.
In our view, what has fallen so far is Bashar al-Assad himself, but his regime is not fully gone yet. There's still much work ahead of us to fully bring it down and be able to say that Syria has become free and that the last remnants of this regime, those who committed crimes against the Syrian people, have been eliminated. We are now part of Syrian human rights organizations operating in the European Union and the United States. Our work is ongoing and extends beyond the Caesar file. We've collected numerous other documents from inside Syria and expect to obtain more soon.
الوثائق التي حصلنا عليها حتى الآن من الداخل السوري والتي ربما نحصل عليها في القريب.
Sami reveals new findings, including previously unknown detention centers, as part of his team's ongoing work to uncover regime atrocities. He also describes how living under the regime felt like being in a prison where any interaction could lead to detention, torture, or worse.
We've obtained a portion of these documents which contain critical and dangerous information. We might acquire additional files that will complement our work, which goes far beyond the Caesar file. The Caesar file covers a limited period and geographic area. Today we've identified previously unknown detention centers in Damascus, whose existence had never been publicly acknowledged. I can't claim certainty, but I can say that we have documents identifying prisons in Damascus whose names were previously unknown.
لا أستطيع أن أدعي ذلك ولكن
We're familiar with facilities like the Air Force Intelligence Branch, the Political Security Prison, Adra Prison and Seydnaya Prison. Seydnaya in particular can be considered the Syrian Bastille, but this regime's crimes extend far beyond detaining people in conventional cells. For me, all of Syria was a prison. Walking the streets felt no different from being in a jail cell. While prisons might have low ceilings and locked doors, even those walking the streets were potential detainees at any moment. You might get into a taxi for a short trip, intending to pay 50 liras to reach your destination, but a casual or naive comment to the driver could redirect your path to a security branch or patrol station where you would pay for that ride with the rest of your life. I believe there's still much to uncover.
لكي تدفع ثمن هذا المشوار بقية عمرك.
While Syrians all over the world have been celebrating the fall of al-Assad, Sami warns of what's to come if people truly believe that the entire regime had been toppled within days.
اسمح لي أن أقول أنه من السذاجة أن نعتقد بأن نظام عمره 60 عاما يمكن أن نقول إننا قضينا عليه في 6 أيام.
Let me say this. It's naive to think that a regime that has lasted for 60 years can be toppled in 6 days. Anyone making such claims insults the intelligence of the Syrian people. We've endured 3 generations under this oppressive and criminal regime, and every day we uncover thousands of documents revealing the extent of its crimes and the sadistic pleasure some of its operatives took in torturing and killing Syrians. Neither I nor anyone else can claim that this regime has truly fallen just because its head fled, or others raised a new flag. A green flag doesn't wipe the blood off anyone's hands. I cannot continue living in Syria while next door resides a man who reeks of bloodshed. I don't want to dampen the joy of our people in Syria, but I emphasize that to sustain this joy and stability, we must work towards transitional justice and accountability, not reconciliation. Reconciliation can be reserved for personal disputes and minor matters. No one reconciles over the blood of the people.
المصالحة في الخلافات الشخصية والأمور الصغيرة. لا أحد يصالح على دماء الناس. لا أقول أن هناك عمل مقصود لإعادة إنتاج النظام أبدا وإنما
I'm not suggesting there's a deliberate effort to revive the regime, but I caution our people in Syria, And the heroes who expanded the Green Zone, from Idlib, the capital of the revolution in recent years, to the south of Syria and Damascus itself. We must remain vigilant to ensure no one undermines our victory. We must systematically and meticulously work toward holding all perpetrators of violations accountable. This requires securing documents and removing former regime employees from positions of influence, regardless of the institutions they serve. However, I'm realistic. I can't advocate for expelling everyone from their positions. That's not feasible. But I urge our people on the ground and the heroes who liberated Damascus and other cities to prioritize this issue and handle it carefully.
Finally, Sami reflects on his wish to have been in Damascus the day it was liberated.
I wish I could have been in Damascus the day it was liberated. I wish I could have been in my hometown of Al-Tal on that day. I hope this moment comes very soon.
That was Sami's account, offering a rare and critical perspective into his journey and ongoing pursuit of justice for the victims of the al-Assad regime. As the world watches and everyone waits to see what the future holds for this Middle Eastern country after an 11-year civil war. From Arabiya News, I'm Joanne Syria. Thank you for watching.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence, they've got to have a vote and a say. It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers